Welcome to Mr. Nightbleed. Today, 6 scariest real events from America's most haunted cemeteries takes us back to the quiet edges of the world, where the living fall silent and only the cold wind moves between the stones. These are the places where the soil remembers, where graves whisper, and where some of the dead never truly settled. Every event you're about to hear is real, told by people who entered these cemeteries and felt something cold watching from beneath the earth. My goal this month is to reach 4,000 subscribers. Nearly 90% of viewers listen, shiver, and disappear into the dark without subscribing. Don't be one of them. Join the darkness and subscribe now. Before we begin, tell me in the comments where you're watching from, what time it is for you, and if there's a grave or cemetery in your town that truly unsettles you. Because when the world sleeps and the soil settles, not everything beneath it rests. Kill the lights. Silence the world. Take a slow breath. Let's begin. My name is Raymond Dupree, and I'm from Thibodaux, Louisiana. I'm not much of a storyteller in real life. Mostly I just sit out on my porch in the evenings with a thermos of coffee and let the night take over. Folks who know me would tell you I'm pretty practical, not the type to jump at shadows. I spent a little over 30 years working as a claims examiner for an insurance company down in Baton Rouge. Long days at a desk, long drives back and forth, a whole lot of paperwork and people who only called when something had gone wrong. You learn to look for what's reasonable, what makes sense on paper. That kind of mindset sticks to you, even when you're home and done for the day. These days I'm retired. I live in a small one-story house on a narrow road outside town. It's not much. Just wood siding that could use paint again, a little porch with 2 old chairs, and a screen door that complains every time it opens. The kind of place you'd drive past without really seeing, except for one thing. It happens to sit right across from St. Francis Cemetery. If I step out onto my porch and look straight ahead, that's what I see. The low iron fence, the old gate that doesn't quite meet in the middle, and beyond that, the stones. The cemetery isn't big. You could walk from one end to the other in a few minutes if you didn't stop to read anything. It's one of those pre-Civil War places, started small and added on to over the years. Near the front it's fairly neat, grass kept trimmed, newer stones standing straight. Past the first gravel path, it gets wilder. The back half is mossy and overgrown in spots, like the maintenance crews just kind of gave up once they got past the main family plots. Some of the headstones lean at strange angles. Some have sunk so low you only see the tops. There's a broken angel statue near the middle, just a head and one wing left, and off to the left there's a single grave set apart from the others, a few yards away from any neighbor, like somebody didn't want it mixed in. You wouldn't notice that on a quick drive-by, but when you look at it every day, little things stand out. My cousin Travis moved in with me about 5 years ago when he got a job over at the plant, running machines. He's younger than me by a good 15 years, a talkative type, always got music going or a game on. The arrangement works out fine. He pays a bit of rent, takes care of the heavier yard work my knees don't appreciate anymore, and I handle most of the cooking. He thought it was funny at first, living across from a cemetery. Told everybody at work he had cheap rent and quiet neighbors, that kind of joke. I heard it from 3 different people before the end of that first month. Our life is pretty simple. In the morning I get up before Travis does, put on a pot of coffee, and check the mail if it's not too early to be wandering around in my robe. I keep to routines. 2 slices of toast, local AM station playing soft old songs that fade in and out depending on the weather, same chipped mug I've used for years. Travis leaves around 6:30 when he's on day shift, boots thudding down the steps, truck engine coughing once before it settles. In the evenings, if it's not too hot, we sit out front. Sometimes we talk, sometimes we don't. The porch light hums and draws in a few moths. You can hear dogs barking somewhere down the road, and every now and then the low horn of a train moving through town if the wind's right. The cemetery, at first, was just part of the scenery. Cars would pull up now and then, especially on Sundays. Older folks visiting family plots, couples in nice clothes carrying flowers. Sometimes a church group would come through, or a school project. The iron gate squeaks when it opens, and the gravel on the path has a very particular crunch to it. I got used to that sound. People coming and going. It never bothered me. I'd sit there on the porch, sipping my coffee, and watch them moving quietly among the stones. There was something peaceful about it, really. The dates went all the way back to the 1800s. You could see whole families laid out in neat rows, same surnames repeated, lambs carved on the stones where children were buried. It made you feel like you knew the town in a different way. For a long time, that was all it was. A quiet old cemetery, a quiet old man, and his cousin trying to get his life steady again. Nothing special. If you had asked me then, I would have told you I slept fine, ate fine, didn't think much about what was across the road. I guess the first thing I noticed that felt a little off was the gate. It was one of those small things you tell yourself you're overthinking. The iron gate at Street Francis hangs a bit crooked. There's a chain you can loop through when they close it at sunset, but most of the time they just bring it halfway in. The wind here can be fussy, especially in the afternoons when storms are rolling through, so the gate swinging a little wasn't anything strange. But I started seeing it standing wide open in the mornings, on days when there hadn't been any noticeable wind at all. The city crew usually comes by on Wednesdays to mow and pick up trash. If they'd been through, that would make sense. But sometimes it would be Monday or Saturday, and I'd see the gate standing all the way open not long after sunrise, with no cars out front and no one moving around inside. I'd watch for a while, expecting to see someone, but the place would stay empty. A few hours later, I'd look up, and the gate would be pulled back to its usual half-open position. I never saw anybody touch it. I mentioned it to Travis once when we were out there grilling. He laughed and said, maybe they let them stretch their legs at night. That was the kind of joke he liked to make. I told him it was probably just kids, or the groundskeeper forgetting. Stuff like that doesn't sound like anything when you say it out loud. Another thing that showed up, and this one bothered me more than it should have, was the flowers. Most of the graves at Street Francis don't get regular visitors anymore. Holidays, sure, or an anniversary once in a while. You start to recognize which ones have family still in town. There was one grave, though, that started getting fresh flowers every few days. It was that single one off to the side, the one that sits by itself a little ways from the others. White stone, name worn soft enough you have to squint to read it, date from the 1872. At first, I figured I'd just never paid attention. People have their ways, and if someone wanted to be private about visiting, that was their right. But the thing is, I never saw anyone cross to it. I'd noticed the flowers on a Tuesday morning, maybe, bright and new, no leaves wilted yet. By Friday they'd be curled and brown, and then sometime between Friday afternoon and Saturday evening there'd be a new bunch sitting there. It wasn't always the same kind. Sometimes wildflowers, sometimes roses from the grocery store, sometimes just a small bundle of green branches tied with twine, but they were always fresh. You'd think I would have caught somebody bringing them at some point. My porch looks straight over there. I'm out there more than I'm inside, especially in the evenings, but I never did. Travis didn't notice it until I pointed it out, and even then he just shrugged. Maybe they come real early, he said, or you're too busy with that radio of yours. The radio did act up more than usual around that time. I've got an old little AM set that sits on a table by the front window. On certain nights, the signal would fade in and out like usual, but sometimes the static had this odd quality to it. Not voices, exactly, just little rises and dips, like someone breathing across the line. I told myself it was the storm season, the way the air feels heavy and wet, and interference gets worse. Reasonable explanations. That's what I always reached for first. Around then, we had a week or so where Travis was on night shift at the plant. That left me in the house alone after sundown. I didn't mind. I've been alone plenty in my life. I'd sit on the porch with my thermos, watch the last cars go by, then listen as the road went quiet. Out here you can hear the difference. Early evening there's still some traffic, people heading home. After 10, it's mostly trucks on the highway in the distance, frogs in the ditches, insects singing in the trees. One of those nights, it was humid enough that the wood of the porch felt tacky under my bare feet. The porch light was buzzing in that way it does when it's been on too long. And there was a faint smell of rain coming. That wet earth scent that shows up before the first drop falls. I heard the cemetery gate creak open. It was a sound I knew well. I figured someone was late visiting, Maybe had just gotten off a shift like my cousin. I leaned back in my chair and waited to see the shape of a person move across the gravel path. You can't miss that crunching sound. It's sharp, like someone stepping on a box of old buttons. But I didn't hear any footsteps. No car door, either. Just the gate, that one complaint of metal on metal, and then nothing. I got up, a little slower than I used to, and walked to the edge of the porch. My screen door creaked behind me and clapped shut when I let it go. The insects were loud off to the right, in the trees, but directly across from us, near the cemetery. It was strangely quiet. The gate stood just slightly ajar, more than usual, but not flung wide. No one on the path, no one by the fence. I watched for a while and told myself whoever it was had gone in very softly, maybe walking on the grass instead of the gravel for some reason. That would have been the end of it if not for what I heard a few minutes later when I'd gone back inside. I was in the kitchen rinsing out my mug when there was this faint sound like slow, dragging steps on gravel, but not from outside. It sounded like it was under the floor somewhere, down near the front of the house. Just a few crunches, then nothing. Houses make noises at night, I know that. Wood settles, pipes groan, critters get under the porch. I told myself it was a possum shifting around. It didn't fit the sound, but I went with that anyway. The next morning, Travis was back early, coming off his shift. He tossed his keys on the table and said, "You ever hear somebody walking around out front after midnight?" I looked up at him, trying to keep my face neutral. "You mean on the road?" I asked. "No, like right out front," he said. I was trying to get some sleep last week when I was on days, and twice I woke up and heard something on the gravel, like slow steps going back and forth. Thought you were pacing, but then I heard you snoring in your room. We both laughed it off. I told him it was probably some neighbor's kid or a stray dog, though dogs don't usually sound that heavy. He agreed, but I could tell he wasn't completely convinced. Neither was I. We started closing the screen door at night, all the way, with the little hook latch set. It's not much of a lock, but it makes you feel like you've drawn a line between inside and out. I also took to watching the cemetery a little more. I'd find myself standing at the front window, looking at that separate grave with the fresh flowers. Sometimes the wind would slide through the trees, moving everything in one direction, but the flowers on that stone would hardly stir. I know that sounds like something out of a story, but it's just what I saw. Not long after that, we had a solid thunderstorm roll through, one of those August ones that seem to just park over you. The power went out around 9 that night. I was already up, sitting by the window with a flashlight and my old thermos. The house got quiet in that heavy way it does when all the appliances die at once. No fridge, hum, no AC. Even the radio went dead mid-song. Outside, though, you could still hear the wind and the rain hitting the roof, and every few seconds lightning would throw everything into sharp white for an instant. At some point in the middle of all that, I noticed a light in the cemetery. Not a car, not a flashlight moving around. It was a steady, pale glow from somewhere in the middle rows, a little to the right of that broken angel. Just a fixed light, low to the ground, shining even though the entire street, our house included, was dark. I told myself it was somebody's battery lantern, or maybe a solar thing they'd put on a grave. That's common enough now. But when the lightning flashed, I could see the shapes of the stones clearly, and there was nothing there that should have been making that glow. Just grass, the tops of markers, and that light sitting still. Not bright enough to hit anything around it, like it only existed in one spot. It took me back, sitting there, to a memory from a long time ago that I hadn't thought about in years. Back before I ever worked at the insurance office, when I was hauling shrimp at night down from the coast to the processing plants south of Baton Rouge. I was younger then, driving an old truck that always felt one good hill away from giving up. One night, late August, we had a blackout across half the parish. I remember because the station where I'd planned to stop was dark. No pumps, no lights, just silhouettes of the buildings against a dim sky. I was driving the back road past Street Francis for the first time that night, hauling a load that was already a few hours behind schedule. Right as I came up, even with the cemetery, the truck started to sputter. The engine coughed, then just quit. I managed to get it to roll onto the shoulder so I wasn't blocking the whole lane. I sat there for a minute, cursing under my breath, listening to the slow tick of the engine cooling. The town was dark. Every house I could see was out. The only sounds were bugs and the far-off rumble of thunder. Then I noticed it. A single light inside the cemetery. Same place, more or less, where I'd seen it during the storm all these years later. Just a faint, pale circle, like a street lamp that didn't know the power was off. I remember thinking maybe the cemetery had its own backup generator, something to keep a path lit for late visitors, which is silly when you think about it, but that's what popped into my head. I got out of the truck with a flashlight and popped the hood. I'm no mechanic, but I knew how to check the basics: battery connections, fuel line, that sort of thing. The air was thick and hot, and each breath felt like it had weight. While I was standing there with my head under the hood, I heard it. The sound of someone walking on gravel just a little ways behind me. Slow, steady steps, like a person strolling without hurry. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up before I even turned around. I swung the flashlight toward the road, expecting to see a patrol car or some good Samaritan pulling up behind me. There was nothing there. Just the truck, the empty lane, the iron fence of the cemetery across the way, and that pale light shining behind the stones. The footsteps kept going for a second after I'd turned, then stopped all at once. No engine, no voices, no door shutting, just bugs and distant thunder again. I told myself it was the gravel shifting after a gust of wind, or maybe a stray dog running by that I'd just missed with the flashlight. The truck started on the second try after that, and I drove on, pretending I wasn't interested in where that light was coming from. By the time I came back past there a couple of hours later, the power in town was still out, and the light in the cemetery was gone. I didn't think about it much after that night. Not in any serious way. Life was busy. I had bills, work, family stuff. Sitting in my front room during the storm all these years later, watching that same kind of pale glow in what looked like the same spot, I felt like time had folded back on itself a little. I knew better than to trust my memory, but it lined up too neatly to ignore. The power came back on eventually, with that little jump you feel in the house when everything kicks in at once. The light in the cemetery disappeared the second my porch light flicked back on. Travis came home an hour later, soaked from running through the parking lot at work, and I almost told him about the light. I stopped myself. I didn't feel like hearing my own story out loud. The crossing, if you want to call it that, didn't happen in some dramatic way. There was no big moment where something stepped through the fence or anything like that. It was small things around the house that started to feel like they lined up with what was across the road. One morning, I woke before dawn and went to make coffee. The kitchen tile was cold under my feet. When I walked into the living room, I saw a set of faint marks on the floor near the front door. Not clear footprints. Nothing that obvious. Just darker smudges in a narrow line leading from the door toward the hallway, and then fading out. They looked like spots of dried mud that had been half wiped away. Travis had been on nights again, and when he got home I asked him if he'd come in with muddy boots. He shook his head and lifted one foot to show me the clean sole. "Didn't rain last night," he said. "Parking lot was dry." "Why?" I just told him the floor needed sweeping. I got down with a rag and wiped the marks up. The smell that rose when the water hit them was like damp dirt. The kind you get under a layer of dry topsoil when you dig a little deeper. It lingered longer than it should have. Another time, Travis was in his room on his day off and I was in the kitchen. I heard his voice clear as day from the porch calling my name. "Just Ray?" in that casual tone he uses when he wants to know if we have any coffee left. I called back, "Yeah," and walked through the living room, expecting to see him by the door. There was nobody there. The screen door was shut and latched. I opened it, looked out. Nothing on the porch, nothing on the road, no cars in front of the cemetery. When I went back down the hall, Travis was in his room with his headphones on, watching something on his laptop. He looked up when I stepped in and said, "What's up?" I asked him if he'd just called me. He pulled off one ear cup and said, "Huh? No, I've been in here the whole time." He said it real easy, not a hint that he thought it was strange. I didn't press it. A few weeks later, we had a leak in the roof over the front room, and I had a repair guy come out to look at it. Older fellow from town, name of Armand. While he was packing up after checking the attic, He stood by the front window and looked across at the cemetery. "You ever go in there?" he asked me. I said, "Sometimes, when I'm walking. It's quiet." He nodded. "Yeah, my daddy used to say some folks over there never got put where they were supposed to. Records got messed up when they moved the road. They shifted the fence back in the 70s, brought it closer to the houses. Some of the older graves got moved, some didn't. Hard to tell what's where now." I asked him what he meant by that. Exactly. He just shrugged and said, "Those plots aren't all what they look like." Then he changed the subject and started talking about roofing nails like we'd never touched on anything else. It stuck with me though, especially when I thought about that separate grave off to the side, the one that always had fresh flowers and never seemed to have anyone visit. I ended up over at the little local history room by the library not long after, looking through old maps and cemetery lists. I told the woman there I was just curious, which wasn't exactly a lie. She pulled a binder for Street Francis from a shelf and let me sit with it at one of the tables. The records were patchy. You could see where someone had tried to type everything up at some point, but there were gaps, dates missing, names that had been left blank. I found the grave I'd been watching, or I found where it should have been. The map showed a single plot off to the side, marked with a number. In the index, that number had a last name that didn't ring a bell, and under first name, there was nothing written, just a line. The death date was there though, 1879. Under notes, someone had scribbled long ago, moved from original location, and then something I couldn't quite make out. It could have said unknown or unmarked. The ink was so faded. I asked the woman if there were any other records, but she said most of the old church documents had been lost in a flood before she was even born. "We make do with what we have," she said, and gave me a tired smile. That night, I went back to sitting on the porch and trying not to stare at that one grave. Travis came out with a beer and leaned on the railing. "You're gonna make yourself nuts looking over there all the time," he said. I told him I was just thinking. He watched with me for a minute, then said, "You ever notice it's never totally dark in there? Like, even on the nights when the streetlight cuts out, it's like there's something giving off just a little bit of light." I hadn't said a word to him about the storm nights, or the truck breaking down all those years ago. Hearing him say that made something in my chest tighten. "Probably just our eyes adjusting," I said. "Houses across the way, glow from town, that kind of thing." He nodded slowly, but his face said he didn't buy it all the way. We had another outage later that month, shorter this time. The porch light clicked off. The refrigerator stopped. The whole neighborhood went soft and dark. I stayed in my chair, listening to the insects fade out like someone turning down a volume knob. Across the road, the cemetery sat in a kind of gray nothing. No obvious light this time, no clear point I could stare at and say, "There, that's it." But I still had the strong sense that something over there was easier to see than it ought to be. Like there was just enough glow to make out the tops of the stones and the shape of the iron fence, while my own yard was nothing but shadow. I heard gravel crunch again, close, like it was right up against the bottom step of the porch. 2 slow steps, and then a third, and then nothing. The screen door didn't move. There was no breeze hitting my face. I stayed very still and told myself it was probably just the wood settling under me, or some part of the walkway shifting. I've said that to myself a lot over the years. I don't have a grand moment to point to where everything changed. It was more like a gradual slide from, "This is a quiet place to live," into, "I'm keeping track of patterns and trying not to admit I'm doing it." I started noticing that the fresh flowers on that lone grave appeared most often after nights when someone had walked on our gravel. I started realizing that the little smudges on the floor inside the door showed up after storms, the kind that knocked the power out and left us in that strange dimness. I haven't told Travis any of that. He still jokes sometimes, but he also sleeps with his door closed now and doesn't like to sit out on the porch past midnight. If I ask why, he says he's just tired from work. I still go over the reasonable explanations in my head. The gate could be moved by wind. The flowers could be placed by someone with a different schedule than mine. The lights could be tricks of the eyes, batteries, leftover wiring from before I moved in. The sounds could be possums, raccoons, or just old boards complaining. The smudges on the floor might be dirt from our shoes that I just don't notice until later. All of that could be true. Maybe it is. But I've lived across from that cemetery long enough now to know when something is ordinary and when it isn't. I can't prove a thing. I don't have a picture or a recording or a single solid fact that would convince anybody who didn't already half believe. All I have is the way the air feels in my living room on certain nights, heavier than it should be, carrying that faint smell of wet earth even when the ground outside is dry. The way the radio static rises and falls at the same slow pace as those unseen footsteps. The way that grave off to the side never goes long without something living placed on top of it, even though I've never once seen anyone cross the grass to lay it there. So I do what I've always done. I keep my routines. I make my coffee. I sit on the porch and listen to the night. I try not to stare too long at the stones across the road, but my eyes go there anyway. And every evening, when the light starts to dim and the insects begin their singing, I reach over and flip on the switch by the door. I still keep the porch light on, facing the stones. My name is Samuel Cortez, and I'm from Merced, California. Most days now are pretty uneventful. I get up around 6, make coffee in this chipped white mug I've had since my 20s, and drive across town to the distribution yard where I work as a logistics coordinator. It's not glamorous. Mostly screens, dispatch calls, and telling drivers why they're late, even though I spent years being late myself when I was the one out on the highway. I come home after dark, heat something up, and listen to trucks hiss past on Highway 99. It's a quiet life, and I'm fine with that. I've had enough miles and weird nights to last me. I share a small 2-bedroom place with my cousin Miguel. He moved out here from El Paso a few years back for a job at a tire shop, and rent being what it is, we decided to split it. We get along. He's loud where I'm quiet, talks during movies, forgets his socks everywhere. He jokes that I live like an old man because I fall asleep in the recliner with the TV low and the porch light on. It's not that I'm scared of the dark or anything. I just like being able to see outside, even if it's only the walkway and the neighbor's sad little patch of lawn. I don't talk about my driving days much at work. Newer guys think long haul is romantic, like some freedom thing. It's not. It's a lot of waiting in parking lots and eating bad food at worse hours. Still, there are trips that stick with you. Not because they were big wrecks or anything like that. More because, when you look back, you can't quite file them away under normal. You keep trying, but they don't fit. Every once in a while, if Miguel's out late and I'm alone, I catch myself doing this thing. I stand at our front window, lift the curtain just a little, and check the street. I'm not really looking for anything. Just making sure the porch light's still on, I guess. He laughs at me for that. Says, "You know this isn't the desert, Primo. Nothing out there but neighbor cats." He's mostly right. Still, I got the habit somewhere, and I've never lost it. It started a few winters back, on a run I used to make through the Mojave. That was when I was basically living out of a cheap roadside motel across from Boot Hill Cemetery, just outside Victorville. Back then, the porch light wasn't mine. It was a crooked yellow motel light over a row of doors that all looked the same. And across the highway, past a strip of hard-packed dirt and rusted chain link, was a small, early 1900s cemetery that everyone just called Boot Hill. The place itself didn't look creepy at first, not to me. It was small, kind of contained, with a low rise behind it and the highway in front. The chain link fence was rusted through in spots, sagging in others, with some cheap no trespassing signs that were more suggestion than warning. Inside, the stones were weathered and sunken in places, some leaning, some almost swallowed by the ground. There was one tall obelisk in the center, gray and chipped, and a row of stones off to the side that all had the same death year, 1938, though the names were different. It looked old, sure, but not spooky, just tired. We were running team back then, me and Miguel. He didn't have his own place yet, and I liked having someone to split fuel and motel costs with. So we took a long-term deal and ran freight back and forth from the Central Valley to the Vegas area and down toward Barstow. The company got us a decent rate at that motel. It wasn't much one story, L-shaped, faded sign, but it was clean enough, and the manager didn't bother us as long as we paid on time. Our room was number 8, right in the bend of the L. So if you stood outside the door and looked past the cracked asphalt and the road, you had a straight view of the cemetery. In the beginning, it was just part of the scenery. We'd roll in late, the truck engine popping as it cooled, gravel crunching under our boots as we crossed the lot. You could hear the wind moving across the open desert, pushing at the scrub and the plastic bags caught on the fence. Sometimes a train horn would sound way off, this low, long note, and dogs in some distant yard would start barking, then settle down again. The cemetery just sat there under the same sky as everything else, stones catching whatever light the highway threw their way. Miguel thought it was cool, actually. First night we checked in, he stood there with his duffel on his shoulder and said, "Man, look at that. Free Halloween decoration." He'd make jokes like that all the time, wave at the stones when we pulled in, say stuff like, "Evening, neighbors," or "Don't wait up for us." It didn't bother me. If anything, it made the place feel less strange. Just another stop on a long line of stops. Our routine was simple. If we came in early enough, we'd sit on the plastic chairs outside the room, smoking and stretching our backs. The porch light over our door flickered every now and then, buzzing soft. The neon part of the motel sign would flash in uneven patterns, one letter half dead. Inside, the room smelled like old cleaner and desert dust, that kind of dry, closed-up smell. The radiator clanked when it kicked on, and the bathroom fan had a little whine to it, nothing you don't get used to. Across the way, Booth Hill was just there. During the day, you could see more detail, the lichen on some stones, little chips in the edges, gravel paths that were more suggestion than anything. There was this one grave near the front with a low, flat stone and a tiny patch of gravel around it. Someone always seemed to put flowers there. Not bouquets or anything fancy, just small arrangements, carnations, sometimes, or those cheap supermarket roses wrapped in plastic. I figured some relative lived nearby and took care of it. The first odd thing, if you can even call it that, was the gate. It was one of those simple chain-link gates with a latch and a loop of chain wrapped around it. The chain was old and orange with rust, and there was a padlock just hanging there, never actually locked. Every morning, when we'd head out, I'd see the gate closed, chain looped. In the evenings, a lot of the time, it would be standing open just a few inches, like someone had gone in and never bothered to latch it again. I assumed it was kids, or maybe some groundskeeper who didn't care. The place wasn't big enough to need full-time care, but every so often the grass near the front looked trimmed, and someone must have put down that gravel. I didn't think about it much. You see a lot of half-done jobs in towns along the highway. People start something in the morning and finish it whenever. Then there were the flowers. One afternoon we had a layover and nothing to do, so we walked across the road, mostly to stretch our legs. I remember the crunch of the gravel under our boots changing to this thinner, sharper sound as we stepped inside the cemetery, like walking on broken shells. The air felt a little cooler there, probably just the shade from a few scraggly trees and that obelisk casting its skinny shadow. Miguel wandered around reading names out loud, messing up the older ones. "Look at this," he said, tapping one of the stones in that 1938 row. Whole bunch of folks punched out the same year, bad water or something. I told him it might have been a flu, or some mine accident, or just coincidence. He shrugged. I stopped at the grave with the flowers, the one near the front. The stone was low and smooth, the name worn in spots. Someone had set fresh carnations there, still bright. The plastic wrap tucked under the stems. The date of death was from the early 1900s, too far back for a spouse to still be around. Maybe a grandchild, I thought. Maybe the town just did that for some reason. It was nice, actually. Not creepy. Just sad in a simple way. Things stayed normal for a few weeks. The odd noise, the radiator knocking at night, the wind rattling the metal railing outside the rooms, those were all just motel sounds. If I heard a faint voice when I was drifting off, I blamed the TV in the next room or someone talking on their phone in the parking lot. The motion sensor light on the corner of the building would click on and off whenever a car passed or a stray dog wandered through. The first time I got that off feeling was one night when I stepped out alone to smoke. Miguel was in the shower, singing badly over the sound of the water. It was cold enough that my breath showed. and the air smelled like wet asphalt because it had drizzled earlier. The highway was quieter than usual. I remember noticing the insects. Usually there were at least a few, buzzing around the light or chirping in the weeds. That night, as I stepped out, it just sounded cleared out. Still, I walked to the edge of the parking lot, hands in my jacket pockets, cigarette hanging from my lips. The gravel crunched under my boots, then stopped when I did. Across the road, the cemetery sat there, darker than usual. The moon was somewhere behind thin clouds, not giving much light. The gate was open again, just a little. I could see the obelisk like a darker shape against the sky. I heard my name, just Sam, soft, like someone calling you from a couple of rooms down, not sharp, not urgent. I turned my head toward room 10, thinking maybe one of the other drivers had shown up. The curtains were closed, no shadows moving. The only sound was a truck engine idling on the far side of the building. After a second, I shrugged it off. I'm not the jumpy type. I went back inside, told Miguel the water was probably going to run cold soon, and didn't mention it. It was too easy to picture some guest on the far side saying their own Sam, or the wind dragging a sound across the lot. Over the next few nights, things like that kept happening. Little things you wouldn't write down if you were keeping a real log. The motion light by our end of the building started clicking on at odd intervals, but never when we stepped out, only when we were already in bed. I'd be lying there, eyes almost shut, and see the glow edge around the curtain. By the time I sat up and pushed the fabric aside, it would be dark again. Miguel noticed, too. "This place has a ghost cat or something," he said one morning, rubbing sleep from his face as he pulled on his boots. "That light keeps going on and off all night." I heard something on the gravel, like little feet, then nothing. He grinned. "Maybe it's your fans from the graveyard." I told him it was probably the wind or some animal. He nodded, but later, when we were loading up the truck, he stared out toward Boot Hill and said, more quietly, "You ever see anyone actually go in there?" I thought about it and realized I hadn't. Not once. The flowers kept changing, though. The carnations from that first day were gone, and now there were some cheap roses, petals already starting to brown at the edges. On a day off, we stopped by the office to extend our stay. The manager was this middle-aged guy named Ron. With gray hair he kept slicked back and a shirt that never quite buttoned right. He slid the new key card across the counter and said, "You boys get some rest. Storm's supposed to roll through later." Miguel, always the one to poke at things, jerked his thumb toward the window where you could just see the cemetery fence beyond the parked cars. "Hey man, who keeps that place up? We see new flowers on that one grave all the time. Groundskeeper or something?" Ron's expression tightened just a little, some muscle near his jaw. "City sends someone every now and then," he said. "Volunteers. Church folks. People like to remember their own. You know?" "Yeah, but that one up front," Miguel started. Ron cut him off with a quick nod. "Somebody puts flowers there. Always has, far as I know." He reached for a stack of forms like the conversation was over. "You need anything else?" On the way out, Miguel muttered, "Dude does not like small talk." I just said, "He's probably answered that question 100 times." But I filed the look on Ron's face away somewhere in the back of my mind. The storm rolled in that evening like he'd said. The wind kicked up first, whistling around the corners of the building, making the screen door on the office slap against its frame. The sky went from pale to dark in what felt like a few minutes. By the time we parked, the first drops were hitting the windshield in fat splats, and the porch light over our room was flickering like crazy. Inside, the room felt smaller with the wind battering the walls, the radiator ticking nonstop. We ate some microwaved burritos, watched a little TV with the volume low. At some point, Miguel got a text from his boss back in Merced about schedules and said he might have to head home for a couple of days to sort some paperwork out. He joked, "You gonna be okay here alone with your cemetery fan club?" I rolled my eyes. He left the next afternoon, caught a ride with another driver heading north. The room felt even quieter once he was gone. It's one thing to hear strange noises when someone else is there to blame them on. It's another to sit with them alone. Still, I told myself it would be fine. Just a couple of nights. I'd done hundreds alone before. That night, the rain came harder. It drummed on the flat roof, ran down past the window in little rivers. The parking lot turned slick and dark, the puddles reflecting the motel lights. The neon sign buzzed and flickered, throwing odd pulses of light across the doors. You could hear water dripping off the eaves in steady little ticks. I stayed up later than usual, half watching some old movie, answering a couple of dispatch messages. The radiator clanked now and then, and the bathroom fan made that high, thin sound. At some point, the TV screen went fuzzy for a second, like the connection hiccuped. When it came back, the sound was a notch louder than it had been. Little things. Around midnight, I finally turned everything off. The room sank into that kind of half-dark you get with the curtains mostly closed, but not shut tight, light bleeding in around the edges. I lay there listening to the rain ease up. That's when I heard the footsteps. They were soft but distinct, the sound of wet shoes on the exterior walkway outside the rooms. Step, 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 the tiny squeak of rubber and water. They stopped right outside my door. I watched the shadow under the door, waiting to see a pair of feet or a shape move across it when a car passed. Nothing. Then came the knock. Not loud, just 3 knuckles against the door, a little off-center. "Yeah?" I called, staying in bed. "Who is it?" No answer. I sat up, swung my legs over the side, and listened. The radiator clicked. Somewhere down the line, something metal rattled in the wind. No more footsteps, no second knock. I told myself it was some drunk guest at the wrong door. It happens. I got up anyway, checked the deadbolt and the chain. Both already set. I almost opened the door to look, but something about the wet silence on the other side made me decide against it. I went back to bed, waited for my heart to slow down. When I woke up, there were footprints on the floor. They started just inside the door, a little to the right, like someone had stepped around the mat. Dark, wet outlines of shoe soles with a bit of desert mud on them. They weren't big or small, just average. The trail went across the carpet, faded a little, then showed up clearer again on the linoleum near the bathroom. Then, nothing. No prints leading back to the door. I stood there for a long minute, scratching at my jaw. The carpet was old. Sometimes spills looked like shapes if you stared long enough. But I knelt down and touched one of the marks on the linoleum. It was still slightly tacky. Mud, not just water. I checked the door again. Chain still latched, deadbolt still turned. I checked the window. It was shut. No gaps, nothing that would let a person in. I even looked behind the shower curtain, which made me feel ridiculous. But I did it anyway. The room was empty. I told myself I must have come in with wet shoes the night before without realizing it. Maybe I'd walked funny, carrying my bag, and that's why the pattern looked off. People can convince themselves of anything if they want to sleep. I wiped the prints up with one of the thin motel towels, threw it in the tub, and told myself that was that. That evening, I noticed room 12. I hadn't paid attention to the numbers much before, beyond our own. But on the far leg of the L, near where the building ended, there was a door with a yellowed curtain behind it, and a porch light that never seemed to turn on. If there were guests there, I'd never seen them. No cars parked right in front, no open door, nothing. Sometime around 9, I stepped out for air. The storm had moved on, leaving the air cold and clean, smelling like wet dust. The insects were back, but quieter than usual, like they were starting up again after a pause. Across the highway, Booth Hill was a dark patch, the obelisk just visible under a sliver of moon. The gate was standing wide open. Not just a crack open. I looked down the row of rooms. Most were dark. A couple had that blue TV glow seeping through the curtains. And then there was room 12. Its porch light was off, but the room light was on, a dull, yellowish square behind the thin curtain. As I watched, the light flickered once, then steadied. A shape moved past the curtain, slow, like someone walking from one side of the room to the other, no hurry. I could see the outline of a head and shoulders, the suggestion of arms at their sides. Not detailed, just a normal silhouette. I figured someone had finally checked in there. Another driver, maybe. Still, something about the way the manager had talked earlier made me want to check. So I went to the office. The bell above the door gave a little tired ring as I stepped in. Ron was behind the counter, filling in something on a clipboard. The TV in the corner was playing some game show with the sound low. He looked up. Evening. Need more towels? Hey, I said. Did you get someone new in 12? His pen stopped. Why? I shrugged, feeling a little foolish. Just wondered. Lights on down there. Thought that room was kind of, I don't know, shut. Ron's eyes flicked toward the key rack behind him. Each hook had a little plastic tag with a room number. Room 12's tag was hanging there, dull and still. Not on the counter, not in his hand. Nah, he said after a second. Nobody in 12. I just saw the light on, I said. Somebody walking by the window. He turned all the way to look at the rack this time, like maybe he'd missed something. Then he opened a drawer and pulled out a second tag, another 12, older and more worn. He held them both up. Both keys right here. Hasn't been rented out in a while. Maybe you left a lamp on, I said. He shook his head, slower than felt comfortable. I don't go in there after dark. He said it like he hadn't meant to say it out loud. Then he cleared his throat. Probably just a reflection. Headlights, TV, something like that. You know how it is. He set the keys down, one on top of the other, like he didn't want to think about them anymore. You need anything? No, I said. I'm good. On my way back to the room, I checked again. The light in 12 was still on. The silhouette moved once more. That same slow crossing of the window. It didn't look like headlights. It looked like a person. I stood there until the night started to feel like it was pressing on my ears. Then I went back into my room and locked the door. I didn't sleep well. Every little sound seemed too loud. The radiator, the distant bark of a dog, the soft click of the motion light outside going on, off, on again. Around 3, I gave up and went to the window, pulling the curtain back a couple of inches. The parking lot was mostly empty. A single car sat near the office. The air was still. Boot Hill lay across the road, the headstones pale under the thin moonlight. The gate was closed again, chain looped. Room 12's light was off. The window was just a dark square. The next day, after my run, curiosity got the better of me. I walked down to 12 inches broad daylight. Up close, the door looked like all the others' paint chipped along the bottom, room number a little crooked. I tried the knob. It didn't move. On my way back, I ran into Ron coming from the opposite direction, carrying a plastic laundry basket. You lost? He asked, not quite joking. Just taking a walk, I said. You sure nobody's in there? I jerked my chin toward 12. He sighed. The kind of sound someone makes when they've decided something. Look, he said, keeping his voice low even though we were alone. That room's been shut since before I bought this place. Wiring issues, they told me. Bad plumbing. Every time I get a quote to fix it, something else comes up. I keep meaning to deal with it, but no, nobody stays in there. So the light, he cut me off. If you see anything that looks like a light in that window, just do yourself a favor and ignore it. He started walking again, then paused. You boys are paid up through Friday. After that, maybe think about moving on. The way he said it made me feel like a kid being told to leave somebody's yard. I didn't push it. That night, the footprints came back. I woke around 2 because the room felt colder. Not freezing, just wrong for a place with the radiator running. My nose was cold, which doesn't happen often indoors. I lay there for a minute, breathing slow, listening. The insects were quiet again. No trucks passing, no TV from other rooms, just the faint hum of the fridge. I sat up. The air smelled faintly like damp earth, that rich, dark smell you get after digging or turning soil. It didn't belong in a room that was all carpet and concrete beneath. When I turned on the lamp, I saw them, starting near the foot of my bed this time, not the door. Dark, irregular prints on the carpet, then clearer on the bit of linoleum by the bathroom. Not shoe soles now. Bare feet. You could see the outline of toes. Some of them overlapped, like the person had turned around in place. And again, no trail back. Just these half-dried, half-wet marks that ended in the middle of the room. I sat there a long time, lamp on, heart thudding, trying to come up with any explanation that didn't involve someone standing in my room while I slept. Maybe I'd tracked something in myself and the pattern only looked that way because of how the carpet dried. Maybe some leak from the ceiling had made patches of damp that only looked like footprints. I got up and checked the ceiling. Nothing. I checked the bathroom. Dry. The door was still latched, chain still set, window locked. Everything exactly where I'd left it, except for my boots. They were lined up neatly by the door, toes pointing out, even though I remembered kicking them off by the bed. I told myself I was overtired. I'd been running too hard, sleeping in fits. That can mess with your head. I cleaned the prints up again, opened the window a crack to try and get the dirt smell out, then sat on the edge of the bed until the sky started to lighten. I didn't sleep again that night. On my next off day, I walked back to Boot Hill. The air was brisk, and there was a faint breeze that made the sparse trees hiss. The gate was closed but not locked, same as always. Gravel shifted under my shoes as I stepped inside. The row of 1,938 stones looked the same. The obelisk was the same. The grave at the front had flowers again, this time yellow daisies in a small plastic pot. The name on the stone was more worn than I'd remembered. I squinted at it, tracing the letters with my eyes. First name, middle initial, last name. The last name jumped out at me before I could stop it. Cortez. That's not a rare name, I know. But I stood there a little longer than made sense, reading the carved letters again and again. The dates were from decades before I was born. Still, something about seeing my own last name there, paired with a first name that also started with S, made my stomach twist. Later that day, I stopped at the tiny gas station convenience store down the road. The clerk was an older woman with tired eyes and a cross on a chain around her neck. I asked for coffee, made some small talk about the weather. Then, as casually as I could, I said, "That cemetery back there, Boot Hill. You know much about it?" She looked up from the register like I'd asked something personal. "Why?" "Just curious," I said. "We've been staying at the motel across from it. I noticed that one grave near the front always has fresh flowers. Town tradition or something?" She hesitated, then shrugged one shoulder. "Some folks around here like to remember old stories, that's all. Old stories." She handed me my change, eyes flicking toward the window where you could see the top of the obelisk over the gas pumps. "Not my place to tell," she said. "You headed back out soon?" "End of the week, I think." "Good," she said. And that was that. The last night I stayed there alone. Before Miguel came back, the air felt different from the start. It was clear, no storm this time, but there was a sharpness to it that made the hairs on my arms stand up. The motel was less full than usual. A couple of rooms were dark that normally weren't. The office light went out earlier. Ron must have turned in. I found myself sitting on the plastic chair outside my door, coat zipped, staring across at Boot Hill. The gate was closed. No movement. No stray dogs. No kids cutting through. Nothing. The highway noise had thinned out to almost nothing. Even the neon sign sounded quieter. After a while, I noticed that the light in room 12 was on again. Same dull yellow glow, bleeding through the curtain. No porch light, just that inner square. I watched it, waiting for the silhouette. When it came, it wasn't rushed or jerky. Just that same slow pass, like someone pacing their own room, hands at their sides. It went one way, paused, then went back. I realized I was holding my breath. I told myself I was done with this. I went inside, grabbed my keycard, thought about walking straight down there and knocking. Ask whoever it was if they were having fun with their lights and late-night strolls. Before I could work up the nerve, there was a sound behind me. At first, I thought it was the radiator again. Then I realized it was coming from the door. The chain was rattling, just a little, like someone was testing it from the outside, metal on metal. "Hold on," I said, louder than I meant to. My voice sounded small in the room. "I'm coming." The rattling stopped. I went to the door, put my eye to the peephole. Nothing but the dim walkway and the opposite wall. I listened. No footsteps, no voices. I opened the door an inch with the chain still on, peering out. The air outside felt colder than it had a minute before, as if someone had left a freezer open. I stuck my head out, looked both ways. The only thing moving was a scrap of plastic blowing along the fence toward the cemetery. I almost closed the door again, but something pulled my gaze down the row toward room 12. The light in its window was off. Just dark glass now, blacker than the sky. At some point that night, I must have dozed off in the chair by the window, because I woke with a start to the gray light of early morning. My neck hurt. The room was quiet. No footprints this time that I could see from where I sat. I don't know why I did it, but before we checked out for good a couple days later, I asked Ron if I could see 12 inches daylight. Just want to convince myself the wiring's really that bad, I said, trying to turn it into a joke. I keep seeing that light on. He looked at me for a long moment, then reached under the counter and picked up one of the keys. His hand rested on it like it was heavier than the others. "You open it," he said finally. "I'll stand back here." We walked down together, him about 10 feet behind me. The morning sun was bright, throwing long shadows. The air had that dry chill to it. My boots scuffed the concrete. His steps were slower, lighter. At 12, I slid the key in. For a second, it didn't want to turn, like the lock hadn't been moved in years. Then it gave with a soft, gritty click. I pushed the door open. The room smelled stale, like dust and old linen. The curtains were half drawn, letting in a band of light that cut across the floor. The bed was bare, just a stained mattress, no TV, no lamp, nothing plugged in. The light switch on the wall did nothing when I flicked it, and yet, right there on the nightstand, was a ring of darker wood, the kind you get when something hot sits in the same spot over and over. A lamp base, a mug, something like that. A pattern worn into the surface. On the floor near the bed, the carpet was flattened in a path, as if somebody had walked the same track 1,000 times from one side of the room to the other. The air felt a degree cooler, like when you step into a shaded place from the sun. I walked over to the window and pulled the curtain back. From there, you had a perfect line of sight straight to Boot Hill. The grave at the front stood out low stone, little patch of gravel. Fresh flowers bright against all that gray. Something white stuck out from between the nightstand and the wall. I bent down and pulled it free. It was an old motel registration card, the kind people used before everything was digital. The ink had faded, but you could still make out the writing. Room 12. Name S. Cortez. The rest was smudged. I stared at it for a long time, the letters swimming a little. Could have been anybody. Another Cortez, another first name starting with S. Salvador, Sergio, whatever. It was an old card. The top right corner had a date stamp from years back, before I ever drove this route. Still, I felt something tighten in my chest. Behind me, Ron cleared his throat. "You done?" he asked. His voice sounded a little strained. "Yeah," I said. I slipped the card back where I'd found it, for reasons I couldn't explain. "Yeah, I'm done." We left the room. He locked it again, jangling the key a little more than he needed to, then walked back toward the office without another word. I didn't tell Miguel about any of it when he came back. We checked out a day early, took a longer route, and I told him I was just tired of that motel's hard beds. He joked that I must have found a better view somewhere else. Years have passed since then. I don't drive long haul anymore. I sit in an office, send other people down those same highways. At night, I come back to my little place in Merced, step inside, and make sure the deadbolt's turned. Miguel still laughs at me for keeping the porch light on. I try not to think about Boot Hill, or room 12, or how cold the air felt in that empty room. I tell myself the footprints were me, the lights were bad wiring, the card was just a coincidence. People die all the time. Names repeat. Old motels have quirks. Cemeteries get volunteers who don't want attention, that's all. But every so often, when I wake up at 3 for no good reason, I swear I can smell damp earth in my clean little hallway. Sometimes I hear the faint rattle of a chain where there isn't one, or the soft squeak of wet soles on a floor that should be dry. I get up, check the windows, look out at the quiet street, and in my head, clear as if I were standing there now, I can see that low stone at the front of Boot Hill, the gravel around it, and the way the flowers never seem to wilt like they should. I've checked pictures online, and the grave is still there, 100 miles away from my front door. People say that cemeteries mostly forgotten now. The flowers on that grave are always fresh. My name is Walter Hensley, and I'm from Binghamton, New York. I've lived just outside town most of my life, on a little two-lane road people use when they're trying to skip the highway traffic. The house I'm in now is a low, square place with aluminum siding and a porch that sags a bit in the middle. Nothing special. What makes it different is what's across the road from it, a small church with peeling white paint, and behind that, tucked down in a dip you don't see right away from the street, is Coldwater Cemetery. People always think I'm joking when I say my front view is a church and my side view is a graveyard. I'm not. If I stand at my kitchen sink, I can see the tops of the oldest stones through the trees. If I step out on the porch and lean on the rail, I can see the iron fence and the narrow little gravel path that goes through the middle of the graves. I've had worse views. It's quiet. No loud neighbors. No kids cutting through the yard. Just wind in the trees and the occasional crow. I don't live alone. My cousin Mark moved in about 6 years ago when his job in Syracuse went sideways. The cousin who moved for a job thing, I guess you'd call it. He needed a place to land, and I had the extra room since my kids are grown and gone. He pays a little rent, helps with the snow in the yard. He's younger than me by about 10 years, still has more energy than sense most days, but he's good company. First thing he said when he pulled up with his boxes was, "Damn, Walt, you didn't mention the discount cemetery view." I work as an insurance underwriter. Nothing exciting. I sit at a desk in an office on the edge of downtown and look at numbers and reports all day. You'd be surprised how much of life can be boiled down to risk tables. I leave most mornings around 7:30. Coffee in a travel mug, coat zipped up, the porch boards creaking under my boots. I lock the door, listen to the road for a second, and that's usually when I hear the rest of the world waking up. Maybe a dog barking way off, maybe a truck on the highway, maybe just the wind nudging the bare branches over at the cemetery. In the evenings, it's the opposite. I come home, park in the little gravel strip by the hedge, and I can hear the crunch under my tires. The church across the road is mostly unused now, except for a small Sunday service and the occasional wedding when folks want something quaint. They keep the front lot shoveled in winter and mowed in summer, but the graveyard behind it is kind of halfway between cared for and forgotten. Not a dump, just old, quiet, a modest little place from the Victorian era, long before any of us. When Mark and I sit on the porch in the summer, we can see the iron fence that frames the first row of stones. It's not a big cemetery, more like a pocket of land someone decided was enough, back when they thought the town would never grow. The stones go back to the 1800s. Most of the names mean nothing to me. A few show up in street names in town. Haskell, Dunbar, Keating, that kind of thing. A couple of them are leaning at odd angles, and some are sunk low, like the ground just got tired and settled. There's a broken angel statue near the center. You can see the headless shape if the light hits just right through the trees, and if you walk the path, you notice another thing. A cluster of graves that all share the same death year, 1912, carved under soft lichen. I always figured it was some old flu, or a fire, or something like that. We never looked it up. It was just one of those local things you get used to. Most nights are pretty normal. I get home, we put something on the TV. Sometimes Mark cooks, sometimes I do. We argue about whose turn it is to take the trash to the end of the drive. On Sundays, an old bell at the church still rings before the service. It's not loud, just a clear, tired sort of sound that drifts over while I'm reading the paper. For years, that was all the cemetery was to me, a backdrop, a view, a steady reminder that things come and go. The first stuff I noticed didn't feel like anything at all, just small things you'd blame on weather or your own memory. There's a decorative iron gate in the middle of the fence line. It doesn't lock, but you can latch it. When the wind's up, you can hear it rattle. That's normal. Except about 2 summers ago, I started seeing it standing open on mornings after still nights. I walk early, before work, just down the road and back for my knees. I'd step out, breathe that cool air, hear the chipmunks chattering in the hedges, and there it would be. The gate swung wide like someone forgot to close it. At first, I figured the groundskeeper left it that way. Old guy named Dennis who drives a beat-up pickup. But on days I saw him there, he always latched it behind him. "Keeps the deer out," he said once, leaning on his rake. I didn't think much of it. Deer can nudge things. Wind can gust, that sort of thing. Then one Tuesday, I came home from work and Mark was standing on the porch with his hands in his pockets, staring over at the stones. It was late fall, that in-between time when the air smells like cold leaves and exhaust. The sun was down, and the porch light was flickering a little, like it always does when the bulb's about to go. "Do you ever go over there?" he asked. "Where? Church?" I said. He jerked his chin toward the cemetery. "Back behind. You know, the dead people." "Not really," I said. "Walked it a couple times." "Why?" He shrugged. "It's just, I've been noticing flowers." "Flowers," I said. "It's a cemetery." "Yeah, smartass, I know," he said. But he was still watching it, not smiling. "Fresh ones. On the old stones. Like way old. And not on all of them. Just a couple." I glanced over. From where we were, you couldn't see details, just dark shapes and the glint of the iron. "Maybe someone in town still visiting," I said. "Family." He said. "Maybe." A couple days later, on my Saturday off, I went over there. The church door was locked, but the side path around it was open. The gravel under my shoes made that dry, crackling sound. Crows were making a racket in the trees. Then one by one they went quiet as I got closer. I passed the crumbling stone wall that marks the edge of the church's property and stepped through the open gate. It's funny, for a place full of dead people, it smelled like cut grass and damp earth, not rot or anything dramatic. The air was cooler there, out of the sun. I followed the gravel path. It wound between the stones, past the broken angel, past a family plot with the same surname on every stone. And there they were, two very old headstones with dates from the 1872, each with a small bunch of fresh flowers leaning against them. Carnations. Not store-bought bouquet style, just stems tied with twine. No card. No sign that anyone had been there. Grass around them was dewy but untrampled. I stood there for a minute, hands in my jacket pockets, feeling the wind slide around my ears. "Okay," I said out loud, quietly. "Someone's got better memory than I do." I walked home and didn't mention it to Mark. It was just a thing, odd but explainable. Somebody keeping some old promise. Odd things kept stacking up though. We have a motion sensor light at the corner of the house, facing the road and the cemetery. I put it in after some kids egged the mailbox a few years back. It goes on for deer, raccoons, delivery trucks, all that. But that winter, it started clicking on at times when there was nothing there. I'd be in my chair, half dozing with the TV on low, and the room would get that faint extra glow from the side window. I'd glance out and see the yard pale and sharp, but no movement. No car, no deer. Sometimes the light would pop on 3 or 4 times in a row, with a few seconds of darkness between. I told myself it was a bad sensor. I even dug around in the basement looking for the manual. Never actually replaced it though. Then there were the sounds. One night in early spring, I woke up around 3 for no good reason. The house was quiet in that way that makes you really hear things, the hum of the refrigerator, the little tick of the baseboard heater. I lay there a while, and that's when I heard it. A faint murmur, like someone talking low outside my window. You know how wind can catch itself around corners and make that hollow, whispery sound? That's what it reminded me of. Not words, just tone. I got up, pulled the curtain back. Nothing there. Just the dark outline of the church and the faint shapes beyond my porch light. I stood there until my feet got cold, then went back to bed, feeling kinda stupid. The next morning at breakfast, Mark said, "You hear somebody outside last night?" I looked up from my eggs. "What time?" "Like 3, he said. "I thought you had the TV on or something." "Heard." "I don't know. Maybe the radio?" "Must have been the pipes," I said. "Or the wind." And I left it at that, but I paid more attention after that. To the wind, to the light, to the gate. It was around then I started thinking about that night back in 1986. I hadn't thought about it in years. That was before this house, back when I was in my 20s and still living in a small rental on the other side of town. Coldwater Cemetery had been there then, too. The church was a little less run down, the paint not as peeled, but the graves were the same. I used that road like everyone else, as a shortcut. One night there was a blizzard, the real heavy kind we used to get more often, with snow coming in sideways and the sky looking like a blank sheet. I was driving my old Ford, trying to get home from a late shift. The heater could barely keep up, and the wipers squeaked with every pass. Right when I got level with the church, the engine coughed and died, just like that, no warning. The car rolled a little and stopped with the hood almost lined up with the cemetery gates. The wind pushed against the car and rocked it just enough to notice. Snow slapped the windshield. I flipped the hazard lights on and sat there, listening to the tick of cooling metal. There was no one else on the road. This was before everyone carried a phone around, so I just had to wait a bit and try starting it again. It took me a minute to realize something was off. At first, I thought it was a trick of the headlights, the way they shone sideways onto the fence and the first few rows of stones. The snow wasn't just blowing in one direction. Over the graves, it seemed to be circling, not wildly, just turning, curling around certain stones in tight loops, while in other spots it fell straight down. I remember leaning forward, my breath fogging the glass, trying to make sense of it. The drifts along the fence line were getting carved into odd shapes, like paths. The snow would rise, hang for a second, then fall again in a pattern that almost looked like steps pacing back and forth in front of one row. Not footprints exactly, just areas where the snow didn't land right away. I reached over and turned on the AM radio, more out of habit than anything. It landed between stations, all static and faint squeals. But under the static, I kept thinking I heard something else. Not clear words, just the rhythm of them. Like someone was talking low, right up against the speaker, and the wind was carrying the meaning away. A gust hit the car hard enough to make me jump, and for a second, it sounded less like wind and more like movement, steps. You know how a heavy coat swishes when someone walks through deep snow? That sound, except it came from all around, not just one side. I sat there, both hands on the wheel, telling myself this was exactly what it looked like, and nothing more. Wind patterns, weird cross drafts from the road, static brain. Eventually, the engine turned over again, and I drove home. I didn't tell anyone about it. It felt too silly, even as I was thinking it. I probably never would have thought about that night again if it hadn't been for the footprints on our porch years later. That was late January, after a light snow. Just 2 inches, that fine powder that squeaks under your boots. I went out early to take the trash can to the road. The sky was that pale blue that means it's going to stay cold all day. The street was mostly clear, but our yard was still white, the hedge capped with it like frosting. I stepped out and saw them right away. A line of prints coming from the direction of the church, across the strip of road, up through our front yard, and straight to the porch steps. They weren't boot prints. They weren't tires either. More like shallow, oval depressions, spaced like short steps, no tread marks, no sharp edges. Just softened dips where the snow had fallen. Differently. I followed them with my eyes. They came up the steps, one after another, neat as anything. They stopped right in front of the door. No turning around, no going back down. Just ended there. I stood there holding the trash can lid, letting it hang from my hand. My first thought was that some kid had messed with us and brushed away the back edges, except the snow on either side was untouched. No scuffs, no drag marks. "Mark," I called over my shoulder. He opened the door behind me with a yawn. "What?" I pointed down. "You do this?" He squinted. "Do what?" "Oh, huh." He stepped out in his socks, shivering. "Weird. Must be the mail guy." "Mail guy doesn't walk straight through the yard," I said. "He uses the path." "Maybe he slipped," Mark said, "or some animal did it. This snow does that sometimes." He went back inside. I forced myself to walk the trash down, listening to the crunch under my boots. When I came back, I looked again. The prints still ended at the door. I checked the side yard, the back. Nothing. I told myself it was just the way the snow had melted under some fallen branch I hadn't noticed. I told myself a lot of things. Still, that night, I made sure the deadbolt was turned all the way, and I paused a second longer than usual before switching off the porch light. After that, I started asking questions in small ways. At the post office, I asked Mrs. Jordan, who's worked there since forever, how long Coldwater Cemetery had been there. "Oh, that old thing," she said, stamping a package. "Before my grandparents, maybe before theirs. All them names hardly ring a bell anymore. New folks don't get buried there, you notice that? They go out to Evergreen now, off the highway. Why not use the old place?" I asked. She pressed her lips together in that way people do when they'd rather not answer. "Not big enough," she said finally. "And the ground, well, there were issues. You don't want to fool with it too much, is what I heard." Then she slid my receipt across the counter and changed the subject. Later that week, I tried the county clerk's office on my lunch break. I said I was curious about the church property because I lived across from it. The woman behind the glass pulled a thin folder and flipped through it. There were maps, some handwritten notes, and a typed list of lot numbers. But when I asked specifically about burial records, she shook her head. "Not much there," she said. "We've got old property surveys and some tax stuff. Actual burial records, if there were any, they'd either be with the church or long gone. Fire in '54 took a bunch of our paper things." Sorry. On my way out, I passed a narrow bulletin board with faded notices. One yellowing newspaper clipping caught my eye. It was from some anniversary edition of the local paper, with a little history blurb. The headline said something like, "Coldwater Chapel marks 125 years." The photo showed the church fresh painted and the cemetery behind it, neat and bright. The caption under it was what stuck in my head. It mentioned, "A small, compact burial ground, limited in size due to soil conditions." That was all. Soil conditions. I thought about the sunken stones and the way the ground dips in places, like a tablecloth that doesn't quite sit flat. Life went on. Bills, work, minor annoyances. But all that other stuff kept dripping in around the edges. Sometimes, when Mark came home late from his shift, he'd pause in the entryway and say something like, "Thought you were up," even though I'd been in bed for an hour. "Why?" I'd ask from my doorway. "I heard you walk down the hall," he'd say. "Heard your door too." "That wasn't me," I'd say. "House settles. Radiator knocks." "Yeah," he'd answer, but his voice never sounded sure. Once, in the middle of summer, we were both sitting out on the porch. The air was heavy. You could smell cut grass and someone grilling a couple houses down. The insects in the trees were loud, that low, constant droning. Then, all at once, they stopped. Not faded, stopped, like somebody hit mute. You don't realize how much background noise there is until it's gone. The silence sat over everything, thick and flat. I could hear the wood of the porch creak under our chairs, my own breath, the faint clank of the church's loose gutter in the breeze. The motion light came on, flooding the yard. I looked straight at it this time. No deer, no person. The gate across the road was standing open, just a dark mouth in the fence. "I hate that," Mark said quietly, "when it all goes quiet like that." "It's just the temperature changing," I said. "Bugs do that when the air shifts." He nodded, but his eyes were on the graves. The insects started up again a minute later, but it was like they were further away. Things in the house started turning up where I hadn't left them, little stuff. My work notebook moved from the kitchen table to the edge of the sink. The TV remote on the floor when I was sure I'd left it on the coffee table. It was easy to blame Mark, or my own foggy memory. "You keep messing with my chair?" I asked him once. "Feels like it's not in the same spot." "Pretty sure gravity's to blame for that one, old man," he said. But later that night I heard him get up, walk down the hallway, and open the front door just a crack. The screen door creaked softly, then snapped shut. "What are you doing?" I called. He hesitated. "Just checking," he said. The thing that pushed it over the edge for me was a folder of old papers I found in the hall closet. I was looking for extra light bulbs and ended up dragging out a cardboard box the previous owner had left. I'd never really gone through it. Inside were old utility bills, church newsletters from the 72nds, and a thin stack of letter-sized paper clipped together. The top page was a photocopy of a handwritten list. Across the top, in faint block letters, it said, "Coldwater Burial Editions, 1,910, 1,915. Under that was a column of names, dates, and brief notes. Most of it was smudged, hard to read. I scanned down the list, not really knowing what I was looking for, until one name made me stop. It was my last name, Hensley. The first name before it was mostly washed out, but the Hensley part was clear enough. The date was 1912. The note next to it was just one word, special. I felt something pinch in the back of my neck. I read it again, tracing the letters with my thumb. A couple lines down, another name had the same note, special. No further explanation. No plot numbers like some of the others had. I took the pages to the county clerk the next day, feeling half stupid as I laid them on the counter. The woman frowned down at them, then called a guy from the back, older, with gray hair and a bowed back. He adjusted his glasses and peered at the list. "Where'd you find this?" he asked. "In my house," I said, "across from the chapel." He nodded slowly, then tapped one knuckle on the word special. "Those? I wouldn't worry on those," he said. "What does it mean?" I asked. He gave a little half shrug. "Sometimes back then, if they didn't have all the proper records, or if it was a different kind of case, they'd mark it like that. Moved remains, paupers, folks they didn't want in the main yard. Not my business, really. But they're buried there," I said. "In cold water?" "Depends what you mean by buried," he said. His eyes flicked up to mine for a second, then away. Boundaries got fuzzy, let's say. The church didn't always follow the county lines exact. A lot of that land was used different ways over the years. "What does that mean?" I said. He shifted, clearly wishing he'd never come out front. "Look," he said, lowering his voice. "Old places like that, they end up taking more than just caskets, okay? Floods, illness, folks who die without anyone to claim them. Not every record is tidy. Not every burial is about death the way we think of it. Sometimes it's about keeping things put." He slid the pages back toward me like he was done. "Best talk to the church if you want more info," he said. Though I doubt anyone there remembers much either. I left with the papers feeling like I'd swallowed ice. The word boundaries stuck with me. Boundaries of the cemetery. Boundaries of the property. Boundaries between here and there, if you want to go that far. That night, the house felt smaller. The radiator in the hallway knocked in irregular bursts, like footsteps that couldn't quite get a rhythm. The wind moved around the corners, making the siding creak. I tried to watch TV with Mark, but my mind kept going back to that list and the swirl of snow in '86 and the way those porch prints had just ended at the door. I went to bed early, left my door a little open the way I always do. It makes me feel less shut in. At some point, I drifted off. I don't know what woke me. Maybe nothing. Maybe that's just what we say when we don't want to admit the exact sound. I opened my eyes and stared at the faint rectangle of the doorway. The hall nightlight was on, casting a weak glow. At first, nothing was different. Then I realized it was too cold. Not just cool, cold. My breath didn't show, but the air had that sharp, thin taste it gets outside in January. I heard the front door latch click. Not bang, not slam. Just that soft metallic sound of a latch settling. I told myself it was the wood contracting. I told myself a lot of things in those few seconds. Then I heard my name. Not shouted, not from far away. Just right outside my bedroom door, spoken low, like someone trying not to wake the whole house. "Walter." I knew Mark's voice, the way he hits the first syllable. This wasn't that. This was flatter, older somehow, the way my grandfather used to say it when he called me in from the yard. I lay there on my side, heart in my throat, not moving. I counted to 10, then 20. Nothing else happened. After a while, my arm started to tingle from staying in one position. I rolled over, reached out, and pushed the door open the rest of the way. The hall was empty. The nightlight glowed. The thermostat on the wall read 62, which wasn't right. I keep it at 68. The floorboards were cold under my feet as I walked to Mark's room. His door was closed. I pushed it open a crack. He was snoring softly, one arm flung over his face. I went to the front door. The chain was still on, the deadbolt still turned, but the inside doorknob was damp and cool to the touch, like metal left out in the night air. In the morning, When the sun finally dragged itself up over the trees, I checked the porch. No prints. Not in the yard, not on the steps. The snow from the last storm had melted, leaving just patches of dirty ice. Still, I swept the boards, listening to the bristles scrape the wood. I didn't tell Mark about the voice. I didn't tell him about the list with my name on it or the clerk's weird comment. I don't know why. Maybe I wanted to keep one thing that was just mine. Or maybe I didn't want to say it out loud and make it solid. Since then, it hasn't been anything big. No floating candles, no shapes in the window, just small things. The porch light will flicker once when I look at the cemetery, steady when I turn away. The insects will go quiet right when I step out on the porch some nights, as if I've walked into their conversation. The motion light still comes on, with no one there. Sometimes, when it snows, I stand at the side window with the lamp off and watch the flakes fall over the graves. Most of the time they drift any which way, soft and random. But now and then I see it again, that slow, circling motion over one corner of the yard, the snow hanging in the air a little longer before it lands, as if something is pacing underneath, tracing a line that isn't on any map. I've thought about moving, selling the place, letting someone else have the charming cottage with historic views. But then I think about that word in the old record's boundaries and about what the clerk said. Not every burial is about death. Sometimes it's about keeping things put. I don't know where the boundaries really are anymore. I'm not sure moving would change much. So I stay. I go to work. I come home. I pay the bills. I nod at the church when the bell rings. I memorize the names on the stones I can see from the porch, especially the ones with my last name. At night, when I lock the door, I pause with my hand on the switch. And I still keep the porch light on, facing the stones. My name is Curtis Langford, and I'm from Vernon, Texas. I've lived a pretty regular life, I guess. Nothing special. I work as an insurance adjuster, mostly desk stuff. A lot of phone calls and photos and people upset about hail damage. I do most of it from home now, sitting at this old dining table by the front window. I drink too much coffee, forget to eat lunch, and I know way more about roofs and fences than anyone really needs to. I share the house with my cousin Mark. He moved up here a couple years back when he got a job at a feed mill on the edge of town. It wasn't some big, emotional thing. He just needed a place, and I had an extra room. We grew up together out in Crowell, so it felt normal. He's loud in the mornings, always banging cabinet doors, and I'm the one who remembers to pay the water bill. That's kind of our dynamic. Our place sits on a 2-lane road at the edge of Vernon, where town sort of thins out into fields. Across that road, straight out our front window, is Red Willow Cemetery. It's not big. You could walk the whole thing in 5 minutes if you're not stopping to read. You've probably driven past 100 places like it without thinking twice. Little gate, small sign, some oak and mesquite trees scattered around. The ground's mostly dry grass and hard dirt, cracked in the summer. It's an old cemetery, pre-Civil War in parts, if you believe the dates on the stones. A lot of the markers from the 1800s lean different ways, like they're tired. Some are sunk down so far you only see the top half of the name. The front section near the roads kept up pretty decent. Mowed grass, trimmed around the newer headstones, but the back half is wild. Grass up to your knees, mesquite limbs hanging down, that kind of thorny brush that catches your jeans. The split rail fence back there is mostly rotted out, posts leaning, rails missing. There's one grave that's set apart from all the others, near the back left corner. No other stones within maybe 20 feet of it. First time I noticed it was just because of how it sat out there alone, like somebody misplaced it. I remember thinking maybe they ran out of room and just stuck the last one in the corner. When we first moved in, though, I didn't think much about the place. If anything, it felt peaceful. The cemetery meant no loud neighbors across the street. No kids with trucks blasting music, no parties. At night, the only sound you'd hear from that direction was wind through the trees and, once in a while, a flag rope tapping against the flagpole by the entrance. On Sundays, you'd see a few cars pull up, folks in their church clothes bringing flowers. It just felt normal. My days fell into a pretty steady rhythm. I'd get up around 6, make coffee, and sit on the porch while the sky went from dark to gray to that washed-out Texas blue. I'd watch the light touch the tops of the stones first, then creep down. Mark left around 7 for his shift, always slamming the screen door even when he swore he wasn't. I'd log in around 8, start returning calls, looking at emailed photos of busted windshields and dented siding. Sometimes on my lunch break, if it wasn't too hot, I'd cross the road and walk through the cemetery. It gave my eyes a break from the computer. I'd read names I didn't know, families buried in rows, a lot of the same death year on multiple stones from back in the early 1900s. Flu, I figured, or something like that. The air always smelled like sun-baked grass and dust, and the only sounds were crickets in the high weeds and the crunch of gravel under my shoes on the little path that wound through the front half. Mark thought it was weird I went over there. "You're gonna give yourself nightmares, man," he said one afternoon, leaning in the doorway with a sandwich in his hand. "Who just hangs out in a graveyard for fun?" "It's quiet," I said. "That's all. Better than watching daytime TV." "Yeah, well, if anything follows you back, it's sleeping in your room, not mine," he said and laughed. That was kind of the running joke, the neighbors across the street. For a long time, nothing strange happened, really. I want to be clear about that. Months went by and it was just a cemetery. Wind, grass, birds, cars passing. I slept fine. The first thing that stuck in my mind was the gate. It's a decorative iron gate up front. Not big, just wide enough for a car to pull through onto the short gravel lane. There's one of those simple metal latches on it. During the day, it's usually propped open. At night, some volunteer or city worker, I don't know who, comes by and swings it shut. Not locked, just closed. One night in early spring, I was sitting on the porch, half watching my phone, half zoning out. It was one of those evenings where the wind dies down just after sunset, and everything feels kind of held in place. The streetlight by the gate was buzzing, flickering a little. I remember that clearly. Across the road, the gate was shut. A pickup drove by heading out of town, lights sweeping across the stones. After it passed, I looked back at the gate without really thinking, and it was standing open. Not all the way, but halfway, like somebody had just walked through and hadn't bothered to close it behind them. I sat there a second, trying to remember if I'd really seen it closed. I replayed it in my head. I was pretty sure it had been. The wind was barely moving, just enough to stir a few leaves. The gate was too heavy to swing like that on a light breeze. Still, I told myself it had probably been left half-latched, and the truck's air pushed it or something. There's always some physical explanation if you look for it. I didn't want to be the kind of person who got spooked by a gate. A few nights later, same thing. I was heading to bed and glanced out the front window. Gate shut. I went to brush my teeth, came back out to turn off the porch light, and saw it standing open. No cars had gone by, no wind. Maybe I just missed one. Maybe I didn't hear it. That's what I told myself. The flowers started after that. At first, I didn't even notice a pattern. People bring flowers to cemeteries. That's what they do. But it was that lonely grave in the back corner that finally caught my eye. On one of my lunchtime walks, I made my way farther back than usual, into the wilder section. Grass high around my ankles, the split rail fence behind it leaning like it'd give up soon. That's when I saw that cornerstone again, the one set apart from all the rest. A single vase sat in front of it. Not one of those built-in metal ones, just a simple glass jar, like something that used to hold pickles. In it were fresh white flowers. I don't know flowers, but they looked new, not fake. The stems were still green, not wilted. I remember thinking, someone still comes all the way back here. It was sweet, in a way. The date on the stone was old. I didn't memorize it. Early 1900s, I think. I do remember the year matched several others scattered around, all the same year. Some kind of outbreak. What caught me more was that there weren't any other stones close to it. Just this one, alone in the corner with fresh flowers. A couple days later, on another walk, I noticed the flowers again. Different ones this time, pale yellow instead of white. Still fresh. The jar was the same. I hadn't seen any cars there that morning from my window, but maybe they came while I was on a call. It's easy to miss things when you're not watching for them. That night, Mark brought it up without knowing what I'd seen. We were on the couch, half watching a basketball game. You ever notice that one grave way in the back? He asked. The lonely one? Yeah, I said. I've walked past it a few times. There's always flowers on it, he said. Like, always, even when the others don't have any. That's kind of weird, right? I mean, maybe somebody's just really dedicated, I said. Maybe it's some great-great-grandmother or something. Mark made a face. From the 1800s? You'd think they'd be out of people by now. I'm just saying, I don't see anybody go back there, ever. Front half, yeah. That corner, no. I shrugged it off, but the next morning I found myself watching the cemetery more. While my coffee was brewing, I stood at the window and kept an eye on the gate, the path, that back corner I could barely see from the house. The sun was just coming up, painting everything that kind of gray-blue. A dog barked a few houses down. Somewhere a screen door creaked. My porch light clicked off. Nothing happened. Nobody walked in. Still, when I went over at lunch, there were new flowers again. Bright red ones this time. It hadn't even been windy enough to blow trash around, let alone tear up plants. The jar was damp around the rim, like someone had just filled it with water. I kept telling myself there were a dozen ways I could have missed whoever it was. Maybe they came at night. Maybe they parked down the road and cut through the back fence. People are weird about graves. They do quiet rituals. I didn't need to make it into a big thing. It probably would have stayed just a little odd detail in my week if it hadn't lined up with something I remembered from before I ever lived there. When I was in my 20s, before I went into insurance, I did delivery work for a guy who sold fence posts and cattle panels out of a yard outside town. I'd haul loads out to ranches before dawn, when the air was still cool. One morning, I parked my truck along that same road, right next to Red Willow Cemetery. I needed to fix a loose strap in the back. The load had shifted. It was still dark. The only light came from that same road lamp by the gate, flickering even back then. Crickets were going full force in the ditch. I remember smelling damp dirt and diesel and the faint sweetness of some kind of wildflower. I hopped out, boots crunching on gravel, and walked along the side of the truck, tugging on the straps. That's when I heard footsteps in the grass on the far side of the fence. Slow, steady. Not a rabbit or something skittering around heavy enough to sound like a person walking. I could hear the stalks parting, swishing aside. I figured it was someone out stretching their legs, maybe walking a dog. Without thinking, I turned my head toward the sound. The footsteps stopped. Crickets kept chirping, road lamp buzzing, but that was it. I didn't see anyone, no shadow, nothing moving. I looked away, back to the strap. As soon as I did, the footsteps started again. This time they sounded like they were circling, moving along the inside of the fence line, slow. Grass and weeds swishing. One step, another. Whoever it was taking their time. I turned quickly to catch them, and again everything went still. Dead still. Even the crickets cut off. It was like someone had pressed pause on the whole scene. I remember my heart thudding in my chest, and that hollow feeling you get in your stomach when you almost have a car accident. I stood there for a moment, feeling stupid. I called out, "Hello?" and my voice sounded too loud in the quiet. No answer. The crickets started up again after a few seconds, like someone flipped them back on. I told myself it was just my imagination, that maybe I'd heard my own boots echo, or the wind shifting the grass in a pattern that sounded like steps. People mishear things in the dark. I finished with the strap, got back in the truck, and drove off. I didn't think about that morning much after that. It felt like one of those weird, half-awake memories you're never sure really happened. I only remembered it so clearly again after moving across the street, when the gate and the flowers and that same flickering light started to line up in my mind. Things inside the house didn't feel off all at once. It was small stuff. The porch light, for one. Its motion activated, pointing straight toward the road and the cemetery gate. We installed it that first fall, when the days got shorter. There were nights when it would click on even though no cars had gone by and no one was walking past. I'd be in the living room and see the glow creep along the wall, just this rectangle of yellow sliding across the ceiling. I'd peek through the curtains and see the light burning bright over the front steps, but no movement outside. No rabbits, no cats, no moths big enough to set it off. Just the empty road and the graves, lit up in patches under the street lamp and our porch light. "Sensor's too sensitive," Mark said. "We should angle it down or something." We tried. It still came on, often right around the same time every night, 2:30 in the morning. I'd wake up, not sure why, and see the edge of light under my door from the hallway. I'd listen, and sometimes I'd hear the faint creak of the front step, like someone had just taken one careful step and stopped. Then, nothing. Just the house settling, the fridge humming. I told myself it was temperature shifts. Wood moves when it cools. Old steps creak. It's not a big mystery. Mark started making more jokes about the neighbors. Most of the time he laughed, but once in a while he'd say something that didn't sound like a joke. "You ever notice it's quieter when that corner grave has new flowers?" he asked once, standing with a beer bottle in his hand, staring out the window. "What do you mean?" I asked. "Like birds, dogs, all of it. It's just less. I don't know. Maybe I'm just picking up what you're worried about." "I'm not worried about anything," I said. And at the time, I believed it. Sort of. I started going through old county records one afternoon for work, checking property lines on a claim. The system the county has online is clunky, but you can pull up historic maps if you know where to click. I got curious and put in our address. The scan that came up was an old plat map, the kind with faded ink and pretty handwriting. Our lot and the cemetery were both marked out. Red Willow hadn't always been called that. There was another name scribbled there first, overwritten later. Something starting with an L, maybe. Hard to tell. The thing that caught my eye was a little note near the back corner of the cemetery, right where that lone grave sat now. The handwriting was small and crooked. Langford plot. Disinterred. I sat back in my chair for a second. Langford is not the rarest name in the world, but it's not Smith either. My family's been in Texas a long time, sure, but I didn't know anything about relatives buried in Vernon, let alone moved. Disinterred. The word said something had been taken out, not put in. I zoomed in, stared at it, and then told myself it didn't mean much. There are probably other Langfords, maybe some ancestor. Maybe the stones were moved to a bigger cemetery in town, and that lone grave was just some leftover marker that never got updated on the map. The year on it being the same as all those other stones could just mean whatever flu or disease hit everyone hit that branch of the family too. Coincidence. That night, the light came on again. It was around 2. I woke up to the soft click and the faint hum of the bulb. The house was otherwise quiet, air conditioner off, no traffic. I heard a single creak from the front step, then another, like someone putting their weight down slowly. I told myself it was just my brain listening for it now, filling in gaps. Still, I swung my feet out of bed, sat there for a minute in the dark, and then got up. The floor under my bare feet felt cool, almost cold, even though the air wasn't. I opened my door and stepped into the hallway. The light from the porch stretched under the front door, a bright line. As I got closer, I heard something, not voices, exactly. More like the low murmur you hear when you pass a room full of people talking quietly. It was so faint I couldn't make out words, just the rise and fall, like breathing wrapped in sound. It seemed to be coming from the other side of the door, or maybe from the wall, or maybe from my own head. Hard to say. I stood there with my hand on the doorknob for a good 30 seconds. The murmur stopped abruptly. The silence after felt heavier than the noise had. The porch light clicked off. I opened the door. No one there. The road was empty. Across the street, the cemetery sat under the flickering street lamp, stones pale and flat in the weak light. The gate was standing open again. I watched it for a long time, waiting for it to move. It didn't. When I turned to go back inside, I noticed something on the floor just inside the threshold. 3 faint marks, like someone had stepped there with shoes damp enough to darken the wood but not leave standing water. The outlines weren't sharp, more like suggestions: heel, ball of the foot, toes blurred. Red-brown dust had caught in them, the same color as the dirt across the road. I crouched down to look closer, and by the time I reached out to touch one, my fingertip didn't find moisture. It was already dry, just a slight roughness, like the grain had lifted. I straightened up, looking back out at the cemetery again. The wind picked up a little, and I heard leaves scrape along the pavement. Mark teased me about it the next morning when I mentioned the footprints. "You sure you didn't track that in?" he asked, mouth full of scrambled eggs. "I was barefoot," I said. Sleepwalking then, he said, grinning. You got up, walked out, stared at your ghost cousins, came back in, and forgot. Yeah, I said. Maybe. I let it drop. A week or so later, I stopped in at the little grocery store near our place. It's the kind where everyone knows everyone, or at least recognizes faces. The woman at the register, Mrs. Keene, has to be in her 70s. Thin, white hair pulled back tight. She's the kind of person who notices things whether she wants to or not. As she rang up my coffee and bread, she nodded toward the window where you could see the top of a few headstones across the way. You folks settling in all right over there? She asked. Yeah, I said. House is fine. Quiet neighbors. She gave a little smile, then looked down at the register. You're kin to the Langfords out toward Crowell, aren't you? Some of them, I said. My parents. Couple of uncles. She hesitated, fingers hovering over the keys. Different branch, I expect, she said finally. That's old ground across the road. Some of those stones are more symbolic than anything now. What do you mean? I asked. She shook her head a little. Town moved folks around. Back when they widened the road and put in the new line. Papers got signed. Some families agreed. Some didn't. They say not all the arrangements were followed like they should have been. She hit the total button, slid my receipt toward me. Doesn't matter much now. Dirt's dirt. I wanted to ask more about the word symbolic, about who was moved and who wasn't, but the guy behind me in line cleared his throat, and the moment passed. She was already saying hello to him by the time I picked up my bag. That night, Mark was working late, covering an extra shift at the mill. I was alone in the house. Wind was up, making the power line sing a little. The radiator knocked in that uneven way it does when air's in the system. Somewhere far off, I heard a train horn, long and low. I turned the TV off around 11 and just sat in the quiet for a bit. The house creaked here and there, normal old wood sounds. I could hear the occasional car pass on the road, the rumble fading out toward town. On impulse, I got up, put on my shoes, and stepped outside. The air was cooler than it had been in days, almost chilly. The porch light clicked on, painting the steps and a strip of grass in front of me. Across the street, the cemetery lay in that flat, pale light from the road lamp. The gate was shut. I crossed the road anyway, gravel crunching under my feet, and pushed the gate open myself. It squealed a little. Inside, the air felt somehow different, still, but heavy, like before a storm. The crickets were quieter, not silent but thinner, like they'd backed off a bit. I followed the gravel path past the newer stones, my shoes sounding too loud. When I reached the back half, where the grass grew taller, the sounds of the road faded. My jeans brushed against the stems, making a soft shushing noise. I could feel the rough wood of the old split-rail fence when I ran my fingers along it. The smell of dry earth and something faintly sweet, maybe mesquite blossoms or some other scrub plant, filled the air. I walked over to that lone grave in the corner. The jar was there, of course. The flowers this time were small and purple, clustered tight. They looked fresh. No browning at the edges, no droop. I looked at the name on the stone again, pushing aside a strand of grass. The last name was mine, Langford. The first name was not. Different initial, different person. Born long before me. Died in that same year, stamped on so many other stones scattered around. I let out a breath I didn't realize I'd been holding. It made sense. Families repeat last names. Sometimes you find your own on a stone and it doesn't mean anything more than that. A breeze moved through the grass then, just enough to make it ripple around my legs. The crickets cut off all at once. Stillness dropped over the corner like someone had set a lid on it. I became aware, very aware, of the empty space behind me, between me and the path. I turned slowly, half expecting to see someone standing there. There was no one, just the leaning fence, the dark shapes of other stones at a distance, and the faint glow of our porch light across the road. From here, our house looked smaller than it feels inside, one square of yellow in the dark. For a moment, I had the clear, simple thought that I was standing where someone else had stood a long time ago, looking at this same corner, feeling some version of the same thing. Not terror, exactly, Not sadness. Just that sense that the line between where you're supposed to be and where you shouldn't go isn't marked as clearly as you want it to be. Something brushed the back of my shoe. Not hard, just a light tap, like a footstep landing right behind mine. I didn't jump. I didn't run. I just stood there, my body very still, and listened to nothing. The air around my ankles felt cooler than the air at my chest. I left the cemetery without doing anything dramatic. I walked back along the path, closed the gate behind me, crossed the road, and went inside. The porch light clicked off after a moment. The house smelled like dust and whatever Mark had cooked earlier. I locked the front door, more out of habit than fear. At some point after midnight, I woke up for no good reason. The house was dark. I could hear the faint hum of the fridge, a dog barking far away, and then silence again. The porch light did not come on. I lay there on my back, staring at the ceiling, thinking about that old map with Langford Plot disinterred, scribbled on it, and about Mrs. Keene saying some stones were symbolic. I never did find out which ones she meant. I still walk through Red Willow Cemetery sometimes when the day's not too hot and my eyes need a break from screens. I nod at names I recognize from town, and at the ones I only know from those stones. I don't go all the way to the corner every time, but when I do, there are flowers. Always flowers. Sometimes white, sometimes yellow, sometimes purple. The jar never seems to chip or break. I don't wait around to see who brings them. The gate doesn't bother me anymore. The porch light still kicks on some nights at odd hours, even after we adjusted it again. There are still days when the crickets go quiet all at once, and I find myself looking up without knowing why. Most of the time, life just goes on, claims to review, calls to return, Mark clattering around in the kitchen, the radiator knocking once in a while. I've learned not to push too hard on the questions I can't frame in a way that makes sense on paper. Some things can stay half understood and still be real enough to change how you move around in your own house. From our front window, I can see that corner of the cemetery if I angle myself just right. The stone is small from here, almost lost in the grass and mesquite. But even on the hottest days, when everything else out there looks dry and brittle, there's always that little bit of color at its base. The flowers on that grave are always fresh. My name is Harold Benton, and I'm from Chambersburg, Pennsylvania. I'm in my late 60s now, and most of my days are pretty quiet. Coffee in the morning, light breakfast, a walk if my knees don't complain too much. I moved over to Gettysburg back in the early 80s, when I got a job at a little hardware store that doesn't exist anymore. It sat a couple blocks off the square. Nothing special, just a squat brick building with tired fluorescent lights and a bell on the front door that never quite stopped ringing in my ears. The money wasn't great, but it was steady, and back then that was enough. I didn't live far from the store. I rented the top floor of a narrow old house on a side street, across from Evergreen Cemetery. If you've never seen it, it's not as big as folks imagine when they hear Gettysburg Cemetery. The battlefield part gets all the pictures. Evergreen is more modest, tucked up the hill. The section closest to my place was Civil War era, mostly. There's an iron fence along the street, black paint flaking off. And right near the main gate there's this tall obelisk that catches the light in the evenings. A lot of the stones lean a little, and the grass near the back runs wild if the grounds crew falls behind. I didn't live there alone. My cousin Ray moved in with me about 6 months after I got settled. He'd just lost his job in York and said he needed a place to land for a while. That while turned into about 7 years. We weren't especially close growing up, but we got along. He paid part of the rent, kept beer in the fridge, and talked to the TV like it was going to answer him. He liked to joke that we had the best view in town, and then he'd tilt his beer toward the headstones and say, "Evening, neighbors." My job at the hardware store shifted into nights pretty early on. I started as an inventory specialist, which is just a fancy way of saying I counted things in the back and made sure the numbers matched the little carbon copy sheets. After a while, the owner realized I didn't mind staying late, so I kind of slid into doing the closing too. I'd lock up around 11, sometimes closer to midnight if the paperwork was a mess. I walked home most nights. It wasn't far, and I liked the air, even in winter. The streets would be mostly empty, just the occasional car, a dog barking somewhere down the block, a train horn way out past town. To get home, I cut across a side street that ran along Evergreen. My building sat facing the cemetery, with a narrow strip of sidewalk and a patch of grass between the road and that iron fence. Our front windows looked right out over the stones. In the daytime, it was actually kind of nice. You'd see families come by on weekends, college kids with cameras, the odd reenactor in uniform walking slow among the graves. At night, it was quieter. The wind moved through the trees and rattled the old fence, and our porch light would throw a pale circle on the sidewalk and the gate. Ray never minded living across from a cemetery. If anything, he liked it too much. He'd stand at the window with a cigarette and say, "You know, if they're gonna haunt anywhere, it's not gonna be the cemetery. That's just the parking lot." They'd go home, then he'd laugh, like he'd said something deep. I'd tell him he watched too many late-night horror flicks and remind him the rent was due on the 1st. For a long time, the cemetery was just background, part of the view, like the church steeple 2 blocks down or the water tower on the hill. I got used to the sound of gravel crunching when a car pulled in, the clang of the front gate, the groundskeeper's truck rolling over the stones in that slow, cautious way. You stop noticing things when you see them every day. They just become scenery. The first thing that sticks in my mind as odd, even though at the time I didn't give it much weight, was the gate. That main iron gate had a particular squeal when it opened. You could hear it from our living room if the TV wasn't too loud. One Tuesday night, late fall, I remember because there were dry leaves skittering across the pavement and it smelled like cold, it squealed open around 11:30. I was sitting on the couch in my work shirt, working on a cup of coffee I shouldn't have been drinking that late. I heard the squeal, then the soft clank of it hitting the stop. I figured it was the groundskeeper or maybe somebody leaving flowers late. People do that. I didn't get up. About 10 minutes later, I walked into the kitchen to rinse my mug, glanced out the front window, and saw the gate sitting wide open. No car lights in the lot inside. No people. Just the dark line of stones and that obelisk standing there like it always did. The only light was from our porch and the street lamp at the corner, buzzing like it had a bee trapped in it. "Ray, you see anyone go in there?" I called. He was in his room down the hall, radio low, sorting through some papers. "In where?" he yelled back. "Cemetery, gates open." He came out, wiping his hands on his jeans, and we both stood at the window for a while. The wind pushed at the trees, leaves rattled along the sidewalk, and the gate just sat there, swung all the way back. "Probably forgot to close it," he said. "Or the wind got it. You know how it bangs around." I shrugged. It made sense. But the next morning, when I stepped out onto the porch to head to work, the gate was shut. No tire tracks in the gravel. No footprints on the damp patch of soil near the entrance, just like it had been locked all night. That sort of thing happened now and then. Little things. The gate open when it shouldn't be. Fresh flowers appearing on graves that, as far as I could tell, never had visitors. There was one stone in particular, set a little off from the main row. No big statue or anything, just a simple marker, Civil War date, and unknown, carved where the name should be. Some weeks it would look bare. Then I'd come home late one night, glance over, and see a neat bunch of flowers at the base. Not the kind that looked like they came from the grocery store, either. Wildflowers, mostly. Sometimes a single rose, the stem wrapped in what looked like old cloth. Probably locals, I told myself. History buffs, tourists staying at a B&B. I worked near the tourist shops. I knew the type. I could picture some couple walking up there at dusk, holding hands, feeling sad for the unknown soldier. Ray noticed the flowers too. One evening he pointed with his beer bottle and said, "Guy's more popular dead than I am alive." "Maybe you need a better story," I said. "Yeah, maybe he's the one telling it," he said, smirking. He liked to talk that way. Didn't bother me, not really. I'm not jumpy. I was raised going to funerals in small-town churches, seeing open caskets up close. Death is just part of the world. Cemeteries never scared me. It took a while before I saw the man. It was late January, one of those nights where your breath hangs in front of your face and your ears sting if you stay out too long. I'd stayed at the hardware store past midnight, counting boxes in the back and trying to make sense of a shipment that came in with the wrong numbers. My boss had already gone home. I locked up, checked the register twice, and started my walk. The town gets very still at that hour, windows dark, the only sound my boots on the sidewalk and the occasional car hissing by on the main road. When I turned onto the street that runs by Evergreen, I could hear the wind pushing against the iron fence, making this faint, dull rattling. The sky was low, that flat orange-gray you get from streetlights reflecting off light snow. Our porch light was on up ahead, a small yellow square. The gate to the cemetery stood closed. I remember that clearly. Closed. The iron arch over it carried the name, and just under that arch, in the pool of our porch light and the street lamp, someone was standing. At first I thought it was just a reenactor cutting through late. People dress up around here more than you'd think. He stood just inside the fence, behind the gate, one hand lightly resting on the iron. He wore a long, dark coat that hung straight, and a hat with a short brim, not like the baseball caps you see now, more like the old soldier caps you see in pictures, but I'm no expert. The coat looked too thin for the weather. I remember thinking that. As I got closer, he turned his head toward me. His face was pale in the light, not ghostly, just pale, like someone who worked indoors. Tired eyes, like he hadn't slept properly in a long time. There was nothing dramatic about him. He looked like any regular man who'd had a hard life. I was maybe 20, 30 feet away when he dipped his head a little, like a polite nod. I nodded back without really thinking about it, the way you do when you pass someone on the sidewalk at night and you want to show you mean no trouble. I blinked. That's all. Just one blink as I glanced at the sidewalk to watch my footing on a patch of ice. When my eyes came up again, the spot under the arch was empty. The gate hadn't moved. No sound, no shadow walking away, nothing. Just empty space. I stopped there on the sidewalk, breath smoking out in front of me, and waited. I listened for gravel crunching or the squeak of the gate or footsteps heading deeper between the stones. All I heard was the wind and, way off, a dog barking twice and then stopping. The insects were long gone for winter. Everything else was still. Harold, you're tired, I told myself. You just lost track of him in the shadows. Maybe he'd stepped back into the rows. Maybe he'd slipped out another entrance while my head was down. It happens. Your mind skips when you're worn out. I stood there another minute, feeling stupid, then walked on. Ray was half asleep on the couch when I came in, the TV muttering to itself. See anybody out there? He asked, eyes still on the screen. Just some guy, I said. Probably cutting through. He said. They like that gate. I didn't mention the way the man had disappeared. It sounded silly in my own head. Over the next year or so, I saw him maybe 3 more times. Always late, always near that gate, or just inside the fence, always in that dark coat. Once he stood near the obelisk instead, his hand resting on it like he needed it to stay upright. Sometimes he seemed younger, his shoulders straighter, his jaw firmer. Once he looked older, hair thinner at the temples, face lined. The first time I really noticed the difference, I thought I was just misremembering. Maybe I'd filled in details in my head. You do that. Each time, he'd look at me with those same tired eyes, not angry, not pleading, just watching. And each time, he'd give a little nod, and then he wouldn't be there anymore. No big vanishing act. I'd glance away for a step or two, or a car would pass and headlights would sweep over the stones, and when they were gone, he was too. I never saw him move. I tried to be sensible about it. I told myself he was just some local who liked to walk in the cemetery at night. Maybe he worked weird hours like me. Maybe he liked the quiet. The changing age I chalked up to my imagination until it got harder to ignore. I stopped mentioning him to Ray, because the one time I did, he said, "Oh, you met our roommate," and grinned like an idiot. "You're not funny," I said. "Did he say anything?" Ray asked. "No. He will," Ray said, and went back to his beer. Around that time, little things started happening closer to home. Our porch light had a motion sensor installed by the landlord. Before that, it was just a switch inside, but they'd upgraded the wiring and put the new one in to save on electricity. It worked fine most nights. A car would drive by, light would blink on. Squirrel on the railing, it would flicker. Normal stuff. Then it started coming on when nothing moved. Or, at least, nothing I could see. I'd be sitting in the living room with the TV off, just listening to the radiator knocking in the corner and the faint hum of the fridge. And a soft click would sound out front. The light would glow through the curtain, a pale rectangle on the floor. I'd pull the curtain back, and the street would be empty. No cars, no people. The cemetery gate closed. The trees shifting a little in the wind. Once in a while, a crow would flap from one branch to another, but usually it was just the quiet, and our porch light burning for nobody. Probably a bug, I said, or the sensors going bad. Ray would lean around me, peer out, and say, maybe he's closer now. Then he'd wander off, pleased with himself. There were sounds, too, soft ones. Footsteps on the gravel path inside the fence when nobody was there. Not every night. Just sometimes, when the air was very still and our windows were cracked open for the breeze, I'd hear the crunch of someone walking, then stopping, then nothing. No follow-up, no car door, no gate squeak. I'd freeze in my chair, listening, convinced I'd imagined it. After a minute or two, the insects would buzz again, that low, steady sound from the trees. It's funny how you don't notice them until they go quiet. One Saturday, near the start of summer, I went over to the little office by the cemetery entrance. I had a practical reason, or that's what I told myself. I said I wanted to know about volunteer opportunities, helping with cleanup days. Really, I wanted to ask about the unknown stone and see if there were any records of who might be buried there. The clerk was a middle-aged woman with short hair and glasses on a chain. The office smelled like paper and lemon cleaner. She had a fan going in the corner that just pushed the warm air around. I was wondering about that soldier grave near the front, I said, trying to sound casual. The one marked unknown. Is there, like, a ledger or something? For the Civil War section? She gave me one of those looks people give when they're not sure how much to tell you. Then she pulled a big, cracked ledger out from under the counter and set it down. The pages were yellowed, edges soft. Names, dates, plot numbers, all in careful handwriting that got shaky the farther you went back. We flipped through until she found the section that matched the row I lived across from. That one there, I said, pointing to where I thought the unknown should be. There's just one stone without a name. Any note? The entry on that line was smeared. Water damage, she said. It was still legible in places. Confed, soldier. I could read, though somebody had drawn a faint line through confed and written Unc in the margin. The name column was empty. Under comments, in smaller script, were a few words I couldn't quite make out. The ink had feathered out with whatever had soaked the page. Storm a few years back did that, she said. Leaked right through the ceiling. We lost a lot of comments in that section. Nothing else? I asked. She hesitated, then said, we know roughly when he was put there. The body was moved from somewhere else. It wasn't uncommon. Lots of reburials. She pushed her glasses up. That whole row's kind of like that, complicated, records are patchy. Does anyone ever visit that one? I asked, immediately feeling foolish. She closed the ledger with a soft thump. Soldiers get visitors, she said, especially around certain anniversaries. That one seems to have flowers a lot, I said. I was watching her face. History attracts attention, she said, like she was choosing each word. Try not to worry about who leaves what, as long as it's respectful. Then she smiled in that way people do when they're done talking about something. On my way out, I passed a repair guy coming in, carrying a metal toolbox. The door shut behind me with a thud, and the sunlight felt too bright. As I crossed the gravel, I glanced at the unknown stone. There were no flowers on it right then, just a faint ring in the grass where something had been sitting not too long before. Ray said I was overthinking it. You're getting weird in your old age, he told me, which was rich, because he was only 3 years younger than me. Do you ever hear anyone walking over there at night? I asked him. Yeah, he said, not looking away from the game on TV. Sometimes he's louder than others. You're not helping, I said. I'm just saying. He shrugged. It's a town full of dead guys. Maybe one of them's bored. I went back to my routine, count boxes, lock doors, walk home past the cemetery. listened to the wind and the crickets. Most nights, nothing happened. Every so often, I'd catch myself staring too long at the gate or the obelisk, waiting. The man showed up again one damp night in October. You know those evenings where the fog doesn't roll in thick, it just hangs there in strips between the trees? It was like that. My knees were stiff from standing all day, and I was thinking about nothing more than getting my shoes off. As I came up the street, I saw a figure near the gate. I slowed a little, not on purpose. His coat looked heavier this time, buttoned up. The hat was the same style. He stood just off to the side of the arch, close enough that the light caught one side of his face. The other side melted into the gray. He seemed older, not ancient, just worn. Lines at the corners of his eyes, a deeper crease between his brows. His shoulders slumped a little more than before. He was looking toward my building, not at me, like he was waiting for someone inside to notice him. I stopped across from him, hands in my pockets. "Evening," I said, because anything else felt too strange. He turned his head slow, like he'd been pulled out of a thought, and looked right at me. There was a second where our eyes met, and I had this weird, brief feeling that I was looking at a face I'd seen in a mirror after a long, bad week at work. Not a perfect match, just familiar in a way that made my stomach tighten. He gave that same small nod. I blinked. A car came around the corner, headlights washing over the fence and the stones, and I stepped back a bit to get out of the glare. When the light passed, no one stood by the gate. This time, the gate itself was swinging slowly, just a few inches back and forth. No sound. The breeze wasn't strong enough to rattle it like that. It moved once, twice, then went still. "Wind," I muttered, even though there wasn't much of one. My voice sounded too loud in the quiet. That night, the porch light clicked on by itself 3 times between midnight and 3 a.m. I got up for the second one and checked the street. Empty. When I looked down at the bottom of our steps, I saw it. A faint dark mark on the concrete, like someone had stepped there with a damp boot. Not muddy exactly. More like the outline you get when you walk across a floor right after it's been mopped. I squinted, leaned down, touched it. My fingers came away cool, a little gritty, but not dirty. By morning, it was gone. After that, the sounds in the house started. Nothing dramatic. Just a floorboard creaking in the hallway when both of us were sitting still in the living room. The bathroom door easing open a few inches when I swore I'd closed it. Once, the spoon in the sugar bowl was lying on the counter when I came back from getting the mail, and I couldn't remember putting it there. You can brush off a lot of that stuff as forgetfulness. Middle age plays tricks on you. One night, though, I heard somebody say my name. I was half asleep in my chair, the TV flickering low. Ray had already gone to bed. The radiator was ticking like it does when it's cooling down. Outside, the insects had gone quiet, which I barely noticed. I was in that numb, drifting place between waking and sleep when I heard it. Harold. Not loud, not whispering, either. Just a man's voice, right level, like someone calling to you from the next room. It sounded like it came from the hallway. My eyes popped open. My heart did that sudden hard punch in my chest. I listened. The house creaked a little. The fridge hummed. No footsteps, no doors. I stared at the doorway to the hall for a full minute, waiting for Ray to appear. "Ray," I called. His bedroom door opened a crack. "Yeah?" he said, voice thick with sleep. "You call me?" He yawned. "No, I was out." "Okay," I said. "Never mind." He watched me for a second through the gap, then said, "You heard him, didn't you? Go back to bed, Ray." He shut the door without another word. The next day, I almost convinced myself it had been the TV. Some low voice in a commercial drifting into my dreams. It was easier that way. Around that time, I went down to the county records office to look up more about our house. I told the clerk I was interested in the history of the property. A lot of people in Gettysburg are. They didn't think it was weird. The clerk was a thin man with a beard, flipping through manila folders like he'd been doing it his whole life. "Your building sits on part of an older parcel," he said. "Used to be a farmhouse on that spot, back in the 1800s. Then something else. Hard to tell. There was a fire in the courthouse records at one point. We only have partials. He slid a photocopy over to me. On it, in faded ink, was a sketchy map. I traced the lines with my finger. The fenced area labeled Evergreen was smaller on the map, but there was a note along the edge. Someone had written, in a cramped hand, additional burials along east boundary with an arrow pointing right where my street would be. Burials? I asked. Yeah, he said. Happened a lot. Overflow. Temporary stuff that became permanent. They moved some of them into the main cemetery later, supposedly. That's what the note in the margin says. He tapped another scrawl I could barely read. Hard to track who went where. So some of the graves near the front were moved from under the street, I said. Or under your building, he said lightly, as if it were a joke. Then he realized how that sounded and added, long time ago. You're standing on plenty of things in this town, you know. Everything's layers. Right, I said. My mouth felt dry. When I got home that evening, there were flowers on the unknown grave again. Wildflowers, this time. Just the tops showing above the low iron fence, bright against the gray stone. The wind was practically still. Our porch light clicked on as I walked up the steps. Inside, Ray was sitting by the window, staring out. You ever wonder how many times you can come back to the same place? He asked without looking at me. I just walked in the door, Ray, I said. Can we not start with something weird? He huffed a laugh. Just thinking out loud. He tipped his head toward the cemetery. He's been busier lately. I didn't answer. I hung my coat on the hook, listened to it sway a little, then went to wash my hands. The bathroom felt colder than the rest of the apartment. When I came back out, Ray was gone. His bedroom door shut, the TV off. The only light came from the window, pale from the street lamp, and the soft glow of the porch light bleeding around the curtain. A couple of weeks after that, I woke up around 3 a.m. for no good reason. No nightmare, no noise that I remembered. I just came awake all at once, staring at the ceiling. The house was quiet. My mouth was dry, and my head felt packed with cotton. I heard it then, the sound of boots on our hallway floor. Slow, deliberate steps. The boards creaked in a pattern I knew from my own walk to the bathroom at night, but different. Heavier, like someone who hadn't yet learned to roll their foot the way you do on old wood to keep it quiet. The steps came up to my bedroom door and stopped. The doorknob didn't rattle, nothing pushed against the frame, but whoever it was stood there long enough that my heart started to pound in my ears. Ray, I said, my voice breaking more than I liked. No answer. I swallowed, swung my legs over the side of the bed, and sat there, my toes curling against the cold floor. The boards under me were still. When I opened the door, the hallway was empty. A faint draft moved down from the front of the apartment, carrying the smell of cold air and something else. Damp wool, maybe. Old fabric that had seen a lot of weather. I walked down to Ray's room. His door was open a few inches, his bed empty. The covers were thrown back like he'd gotten up in a hurry. The bathroom was empty too. I found him out on the porch. He was standing on the top step, barefoot, arms crossed over his chest against the chill. The porch light glowed above him. Across the street, the cemetery lay in that gray-black way it does at night, headstones standing in quiet rows. Ray, I said, what are you doing? It's freezing. He didn't turn right away. When he did, his face looked strange. Not scared, exactly. More like someone who'd figured something out they wished they hadn't. He was at the foot of my bed, Ray said, just standing there like he thought it was his. He gave a short, shaky laugh. I guess maybe it was, once. Don't start, I said, but my voice didn't have any strength behind it. I followed him, Ray said, nodding toward the cemetery. He walked right out the front door, down the steps, didn't even open it, just passed through. And he went over there. He pointed at the unknown stone, stood there for a second, and then I blinked, and he was gone. You were dreaming, I said automatically. Maybe, he said. You've been dreaming for years, too. We went back inside. I told him to lock his door, told myself to get some sleep. Neither of us did much of that. From then on, I stopped telling myself it was all imagination. I didn't start believing in anything specific, either. I just left a little space in my mind for the possibility that something was happening I didn't have words for. I started noticing patterns. The nights the porch light would go on without reason lined up with certain dates circled in the old ledger I'd photocopied. Reburial dates, mostly. The footsteps in the gravel seemed to come in groups 3 nights in a row, then nothing for a week, then 3 again. Every time I saw the man at the gate, the flowers on the unknown stone changed within a day. Fresh ones. Never wilted, not for long. I went back to the cemetery office once more, months later. The same clerk was there. When I mentioned the unknown stone again, she cut me off. Some plots are sensitive, she said. People get attached. Stories grow. It's better not to dig too deep into them, if you'll pardon the phrase. I just wondered if he ever had a name, I said. She looked at me for a long second, then said quietly, "Those graves aren't what you think they are." She closed the ledger, and that's really all I'm going to say. "Okay," I said. There didn't seem to be anywhere to go from there. I still work with numbers, in a way. Different job now, sitting at a desk, staring at columns on a screen instead of paper. I don't walk home past Evergreen anymore. I live a little farther out, in a smaller place. Ray moved to Ohio 10 years back. We talk once in a while, and when we do, we avoid the subject unless we've both had a drink and the night's gone quiet enough that old things start to feel close again. But I still go back to Gettysburg sometimes. It's not far. I'll park down the street, walk up the hill, and stand by that iron fence. The wind still moves through the trees the same way. The gravel still crunches under my shoes. The obelisk still catches the light in the evenings. Tourists take their pictures. Kids run between the stones until someone tells them not to. I stand at the gate for a few minutes, hand resting on the iron the way I saw his do. Sometimes I feel like if I turned just right, or blinked at a certain moment, I'd catch him standing where I used to stand, looking back at the house where I used to live, as if we're all watching each other from different times stacked on top of each other. There's a lot I don't know about what was moved and what wasn't under that street. I don't know whose footsteps we heard in the hallway, or whose voice knew my name. I don't know if the man in the coat was one person or a dozen, or if my own face and his just blurred together in my memory over the years. I only know one thing for sure. The flowers on that grave are always fresh. My name is Marvin Ellison, and I'm from Macon, Georgia. I grew up in a little one-story house on Riverside Drive, the kind with peeling white paint and a porch that leaned just enough to complain every time you stepped on it. If you walked out our front door and stood on the top step, the first thing you saw straight ahead was Riverside Cemetery. The iron gates, the brick paths, the magnolia trees leaning over the stones. That was just the view. I didn't think anything of it. It was there before I was born, and as far as I knew, it would be there long after I was gone. Back then I worked as an insurance adjuster for a small office downtown. Nothing glamorous. I drove a beige Chevy, wore the same 3 shirts in rotation, and spent most of my days looking at paperwork, asking people the same questions in slightly different ways. When did you notice the damage? Had you had any problems before? That kind of thing. I got home around 5 most evenings, maybe 6 if traffic on Spring Street was dumb. My cousin Derek lived with me then. He'd moved in for a few months when he got a job at the paper mill and somehow just never moved out. Derek used to say he'd only picked my place because I had free security across the street. By that he meant the cemetery. Nobody's breaking into a house across from a bunch of dead people, he'd say, kicking his boots off by the door. He liked to joke about it. He'd make fake moaning sounds if the wind came up or point at the window and say, "Hey Marvin, your neighbors are waving again." He was one of those guys who thought anything even a little creepy was automatically funny. Riverside Cemetery itself never felt scary to me. It's not huge, not one of those sprawling things. It's kind of modest, tucked between the road and where the river bends, with an iron fence that runs along the sidewalk and a decorative gate at the main entrance. The stones range from the 1800s through, well, pretty recent ones, enough that you can still see fresh dates and plastic flowers here and there. The older part, back near the river, is more worn. Some stones have sunk a little, moss, lichen, all that. There's a big obelisk a little off-center and a few family plots all with the same surnames. One magnolia near the middle is big enough that you can hear its leaves bumping against each other when the wind moves through. Our house sat on a slight rise, so if you were on the porch, you could look over the iron fence and see the tops of the stones, the magnolia, and, further back, the river fog when it rolled in. In the evenings, I'd sit in a faded lawn chair out there with a can of soda and just watch the light change over the stones. Bugs whined in the trees, cars moved slower, and eventually, the porch light, this old yellowish bulb that hummed faintly when it warmed up, would be the brightest thing on the street. I had a pretty simple routine. Up at 6, coffee percolator on the stove, local radio murmuring in the kitchen. I'd hear the freight train in the distance some mornings, low and long, rattling through town before most people were awake. Derek worked a rotating shift at the mill, so half the time he was coming in when I was going out, smelling like steam and paper pulp. We'd pass each other in the narrow hallway with a mumbled, "Morning," or "Hey man," and that was that. Across the street, the cemetery stayed steady. Grounds crew came by in a little truck some days, trimming grass along the fence, sweeping gravel back onto the paths. Some weekends you'd see a funeral, slow cars, a line of people in dark clothes, the pastor's voice carrying just barely across the road if the wind was right. Other days, just dog walkers, a runner or two, maybe an old couple moving slowly along the paths. It was quiet, respectful, almost gentle. Honestly, it made the neighborhood feel safer than if we'd just had another row of houses. The porch light was kind of a thing in our family. My dad always said you kept the porch light on if someone you loved was out after dark. You don't let their way home go dark, he'd tell me. He died when I was in my 20s, but I kept that habit. Even on nights when Derek was home and I knew nobody was coming over, I'd click that switch on by habit. The bulb would flicker once or twice, hum a little, then settle into that steady, dull yellow glow, washing down over the steps and part of the sidewalk. For a long time, nothing about any of this felt unusual. We were just two guys splitting rent, living across from some quiet history. I paid my bills, watched a little TV, mowed the patchy lawn on Saturdays, and sometimes swept magnolia leaves that blew over from the cemetery side of the street. That was life. Uneventful, which I appreciated. The first thing I remember that felt a little off, I guess, was the gate. This was late spring, sometime after Derek had started griping about the heat coming in early. It was a weekday evening. I had just gotten home, still in my work shirt, tie loosened. The sky was that flat gray you get right before a storm, but the air was barely moving. I stepped up on the porch and heard this faint squeak, rhythmic. When I looked up, the main iron gate across the street was swinging, just slightly open and back, like someone had given it a push. There wasn't any real wind. The trees were pretty still. A couple of magnolia leaves scraped along the pavement, but it wasn't like the whole place was gusting. I watched it for a while, hand resting on the porch post. The swing of it wasn't wide, just enough that you could see the gap every time it moved. After a minute, I just shrugged. Metal shifts, ground settles. Maybe somebody had gone in and not latched it properly. It happens. That night, though, when I tried to get Rusty to go out the dog we'd adopted from the shelter a few months before he stopped dead at the top step, he was usually all nose, wanting to sniff every bush and crack in the sidewalk. But that night he just stood there, staring straight at the cemetery gate, ears up. I tugged the leash a little. He whined low in his throat, backed up, and sat down hard against my shin. I laughed and said, "Come on, man, it's just a gate." But he wouldn't budge. I finally gave up and let him go in the backyard instead. "You and your spooky dog," Derek said when I told him. He was spreading peanut butter on crackers in the kitchen, bare feet on the linoleum. Probably smelled a raccoon or something. "Yeah, probably," I said. It sounded reasonable enough. A few days later, I noticed something else. There was this one grave near the middle of the cemetery, a little off the main path, with a small, narrow stone that leaned forward just a bit. I saw it all the time from the porch because it lined up almost perfectly with a gap in the branches of that big magnolia. The stone was old, surface kind of eaten up by time. I'd never seen anything on it beyond the usual dirt and moss. One Saturday morning, I stepped out to get the paper, and there they were. A small jar looked like an old jelly jar with water in it, and a handful of white flowers stuck inside, sitting at the base of that stone. The flowers looked fresh, crisp, not drooping at all. I squinted across the street, trying to make out what kind they were. Maybe wildflowers, maybe something from somebody's yard. I don't know. It just struck me because I'd never once seen anyone visit that particular grave. I figured some relative had finally come by. Or maybe one of those local history groups had started cleaning up older graves, leaving flowers. It was a nice thought. Still, I kept glancing at that little jar all weekend. The way it caught the light when the sun moved, the way it sat so neatly against that stone as if it had always belonged there. A week later, after a storm, I noticed the flowers were still there. The jar had been knocked a little sideways, but the flowers weren't wilted. New ones, maybe. Someone really keeping up with it. Again, normal enough if you thought about it. People grieve in all kinds of quiet ways. Around that time, the porch light started acting up. We'd had that same fixture for as long as I could remember. It always hummed, but now and then, late at night, I'd see it flicker. Not just a quick blink, either. It would dim, then brighten a little, then dim again, like it was breathing. I noticed it a couple of times when I was getting a glass of water before bed. I'd walk past the front window and catch that yellow light stuttering on the concrete. I told myself the bulb was old, or the wiring. This house was built sometime in the 42nds. Nothing in it was perfect. I kept meaning to pick up a new bulb from the hardware store, but I'd forget, and the thing kept working well enough that it didn't feel urgent. One night, Derek came in from a late shift, and I heard the screen door creak and clap shut, then open again, then creak. It kept going, like something was catching it and letting it go. From my bedroom I called. "You having trouble out there?" He answered slower than usual. "Nah, it's fine. Just the door. Needs oil." The next morning at breakfast, he said, "That light of yours is weird, man." "What, the porch?" I said, pouring coffee. "Yeah. I was walking up last night, and it looked like it was getting brighter when I got closer, then dim when I backed up. Like it was noticing me." He laughed when he said it, but his eyes didn't quite match the tone. "Probably you were just tired," I said. "Your shift messes with your head." "Yeah," he said. "Yeah, that's probably it." A little while after that, I started walking in the cemetery sometimes. I don't know why exactly. Part of it was just wanting to stretch my legs after sitting all day. Part of it was curiosity about that grave with the flowers. In the evening, when there was still some light left, I'd cross the street, push open the gate, usually it was latched, sometimes not, and walk the gravel paths. The sound of the gravel under my shoes felt loud in the quiet. Birds would be settling down in the trees, and every now and then a crow would call from somewhere back toward the river. Up close, the place had more texture than you see from the porch. You notice how some sections are neatly maintained while others start to look wild. Bits of ivy creeping up stones, faint names worn almost smooth, dates from the 1,870 seconds that take a second to puzzle out. There were a couple of family plots surrounded by low stone borders, all the stones inside with the same last name. One corner had several children's stones with little lambs carved on top. I didn't linger there long. The grave with the jar of flowers was smaller than I'd thought. The stone was only up to my thigh. The base was sunken a bit on one side, so the whole thing leaned. I knelt down and brushed some moss away, trying to read the inscription. The name was hard to make out. M. Vin or Mar N, something like that, and the last name was worn so that all I could clearly see was Leeson. I remember straightening up, wiping my hands on my pants and thinking, that's close. Ellison, Allison, Wilson, old names repeat. I could have taken that as a sign, I suppose, but at the time it just felt like one of those odd little overlaps you get in small southern towns. You grow up around enough church cemeteries, you see your last name on a stone eventually. It's odd, but not unheard of. The flowers were definitely fresh, though. The stems were green and firm, and there were no dead petals on the ground around the jar. Someone had replaced them recently. I looked around for anyone else in the cemetery. There was no one. Just the sound of a truck passing on the road behind me, the iron fence rattling faintly as it went by. One afternoon, I stopped by the little office near the side entrance. It's more like a brick cottage than an office, with 2 windows facing the drive and a small sign about hours taped crookedly on the door. I went in under the excuse of asking about lot availability for a family friend. The woman at the desk had gray hair pulled back tight and large glasses low on her nose. She handed me a pamphlet and started explaining fees and sections, her voice flat like she'd said the same thing 1,000 times. After a bit, I asked, as casually as I could, "Hey, do y'all keep track of who visits the older graves? Like, any groups that maintain those?" She blinked at me. "Some church groups will come through, clean up now and then," she said. "Boy Scouts sometimes." "Why?" "There's this one stone I keep seeing with flowers," I said. "Back near the big magnolia. Small stone, kinda leaning. Looks pretty old." She frowned slightly, glancing past me toward the window. "Though you couldn't see that part of the cemetery from there. We got a lot of small stones back there," she said. "Old sections, been there since the 1800s. Folks come and go." "Yeah," I said. "Makes sense." She flipped through a binder when I mentioned the rough location, running a finger down a list. At one point she stopped, hesitated, and then turned a page. "That area's, some of the records are incomplete," she said. "Lot lines got moved a long time ago. Flooding, erosion, that sort of thing. If you're looking for somebody in particular, you might not find them where the paperwork says." I asked her if she knew anything about stones with the surname ending in "listen" in that section. She pursed her lips, glanced down again, and finally shut the binder. "Record keeping wasn't what it should have been for a long time," she said. "I wouldn't put too much stock in what's written versus what's planted in the ground." She gave me a kind of tight smile after that, the kind that says, "Conversation over." I thanked her and left. On the way out, I noticed a radiology van parked by the side gate for no clear reason. Engine quiet, no one inside. Little things like that started to stick with me. As weeks went on, I began to notice patterns, even though I kept telling myself they weren't patterns. The cemetery gate would be latched most days. Then, every so often, usually late in the evening if I looked out at just the right time, it would be standing slightly open. Not wide, just enough that the line of the fence broke around it. The porch light would flicker on those same nights, dimming right when I stepped to the window. Rusty's behavior got stranger. He stopped wanting to go out front at all after dark. If I tried to take him down the front steps on a leash, he'd plant his paws in the doorway and lean backward with all his weight, nails scrabbling on the wood. But if I opened the back door, he'd trot out, no problem. The only difference between the two doors was what you saw when you opened them. Front door, cemetery. Back door, narrow yard, fence, the neighbor's azaleas. Derek started waking up in the middle of the night. I could hear him pacing in his room, the floor creaking lightly under his feet. One morning, while we were both standing in the kitchen half awake, he said, "You ever hear somebody walk across the front porch but nobody knocks?" I looked up from my coffee. "Like the mailman?" I said. "At 2 in the morning?" he asked. We let it hang there. The fridge hummed. Somewhere outside, a distant dog barked once and stopped. "Nah," I said after a moment. "Probably just the wood settling. This place creaks like it's alive." "Yeah," he said. "Like it's alive." He laughed, but it didn't sound quite right. The summer heat settled in heavy that year. Some nights, damp air from the river pushed up through the stones and across the street, making a low fog gather in the dips of the ground. I'd see it from the window, thin at first, then thicker, until the bases of the stones disappeared and only the tops showed, floating in a soft gray layer. Streetlights turned the fog a faint yellow, and the porch light added its own small circle of color. One night, it must have been sometime in July or August, I couldn't sleep. The air in my bedroom felt stuffy, even with the window cracked. I got up, pulled on a t-shirt, and padded down the hallway. The house was quiet. Derek was on night shift that week, so I was alone. The floorboards under my bare feet were warm, but as I neared the front door, I felt a faint chill, just in that area, as if cold air was seeping in from under the doorframe. The porch light was on. I could hear its low, familiar hum through the door, this background note I'd heard my whole life. I stepped to the front window and pulled the curtain aside a couple of inches. The fog was thick that night. It had crept all the way to the road and softened the outlines of the fence. The magnolia was just a dark mass of leaves, and the stones looked like pale shapes rising out of cotton. The gate stood slightly open. I could see one side of it, the other fading into the haze. At first I didn't notice anything else. Then my eyes settled on a darker patch just inside the gate. It was roughly the height and width of a person standing still. No clear features, just a vertical shape a little darker than the fog around it. I squinted, leaned closer to the glass. The porch light buzzed a little louder, then flickered not off, just down, then up again. I told myself it was a trick of the mist, light hitting some branch or stone at a weird angle. I let the curtain drop, rubbed my eyes with the heels of my hands, stood there for a second, then lifted the curtain again. The dark patch seemed closer to the road. I remember my stomach dropping in this dull way, like missing the bottom step on stairs. I told myself I was misjudging distance. There were no lines out there, nothing to measure against. Fog plays tricks on your depth perception. I'd read that somewhere. I watched a moment longer. Nothing moved. I could hear insects buzzing near the house, but across the street it was quiet. No crickets, no rustling leaves. I let the curtain fall again, walked away, stood in the hallway, feeling the boards under my feet, the faint cool by the door. I told myself out loud, "Go to bed, Marvin." My voice sounded small. I didn't go to bed. Instead, I opened the front door. The screen door gave that long, complaining creak as I pushed it open. The air that hit me was damp and cool, thick with that wet earth smell cemeteries and rivers share. I stepped onto the porch. The wood under my feet felt slightly tacky with humidity. The porch light hummed above me, a little louder now, like it was straining. From the porch, the fog was worse. I could only see the first few feet of the road clearly. The cemetery fence beyond that was a black line, and the gate was a darker interruption. I stood there, one hand on the porch post, and squinted toward where I'd seen the shape. I didn't see anything for a moment. Then, slowly, something like a shadow separated itself from the fog near the gate. Again, no clear outline. Just a density, a vertical line where there should have been nothing. It did not move like a person walking. It didn't sway or shift. It just was. I listened for footsteps, for any sound at all from that direction. Nothing. No gravel crunch, no metal clink of the gate, no breathing. The only sounds were the low buzz of the porch light, the faint hiss of distant traffic, and, weirdly, the absence of bugs across the street. Near me, close to the house, mosquitoes whined. Beyond the road, it was like someone had turned the volume all the way down. I told myself, again, that it was just fog. Maybe a darker patch where the trees were thicker. Maybe my eyes were tired. I swallowed, stepped back inside, and shut the door. The click of the latch sounded louder than it should have. I slid the chain across. I had never used the chain before. I stood there with my hand on the doorknob for a minute, listening. The house creaked once, the small settling sound it always makes when the temperature changes. From somewhere in the kitchen, the fridge cycled on with a hum. Regular sounds. Ordinary. Then, clear as anything, from just outside the front door, I heard my mother's voice. "Marv," she said, the way she used to when I was a kid and she wanted me to come inside. Soft, patient, not urgent. "Marv, honey, open up. My mother has been dead for years." I froze. My first thought wasn't ghosts or anything like that. It was, that sounds exactly like a recording of my mother. Which didn't make any more sense, but it's where my brain went. I didn't move, didn't breathe. After a second, the porch light flickered hard, dimmed almost to nothing, then came back. "Marv," the voice said again. Just once. Just that. Close. Right on the other side of the wood. I told myself, this is a dream. You went back to bed and this is the kind of dream where you think you're awake. I lifted my free hand and pinched the inside of my forearm hard enough to hurt. The pain was sharp, real. The voice did not repeat. Eventually, because I didn't know what else to do and standing there felt worse than moving, I turned the deadbolt and the knob and cracked the door an inch, chain still on. Cold air pushed in through the gap like it had been waiting. It smelled like damp dirt and cut grass and something else, like old flowers left too long in a vase. No one was on the porch. The fog pressed up close to the steps, swirling a little under the porch light. I looked down and saw a dark smear on the floorboards just inside the threshold. It looked like the print of a shoe, faint but clear, as if someone had stepped into the house with muddy soles, and then the mud had half faded. Rusty started barking from the back of the house then. Sharp, frantic barks, nails scrabbling on the kitchen floor. I shut the door, latched it, and stood with my forehead against the wood, breathing slowly until the barking settled down. The next morning, the fog was gone, sky bright and ordinary. Birds were back to their usual noises, and the trains sounded distant again instead of strange. I went to the porch and looked down. The floorboards were dry. There was still a faint outline of something where I'd seen the smear, but it could have been old water damage. I stared at it until my eyes watered, then went inside and got on with my day. A couple of days later, Derek came home from a shift and tossed his keys on the kitchen table. "You move my boots?" he asked. "No," I said. "Why?" "I left them by the door," he said. "They were lined up right by the mat. I come in and one of them's on the porch, like somebody set it out there." We went to look. His left boot was on the mat, right where he usually left it. The right one was sitting upright just outside the threshold, toe pointing toward the cemetery. No scuffs, no sign it had been kicked or knocked. It looked placed. He laughed, but it was this short, breathy sound. "If this is a joke, it's not funny," he said. "I didn't touch your boots," I said. We both knew Rusty wasn't about to pick up a boot and balance it on the edge of the porch. We made a few more jokes anyway, because that felt easier than standing in silence. After that, little things kept going missing and turning up near the front of the house. My insurance paperwork, which I usually kept in a neat stack on the coffee table, ended up once in the narrow front hall, spread like a fan on the floor, the top page showing a claim form with a policy number circled in blue ink. The porch light switch itself felt cold to the touch some evenings, even when the house was warm. One afternoon, I came home to find the living room chair angled slightly toward the front window, though I was sure I'd left it facing the TV. I started asking more questions around town, not just at the cemetery office. At the corner store down the road, an older man named Mr. Hines, who'd lived in the neighborhood longer than anyone, liked to lean on the counter and talk. One day, while he was ringing up my bread and milk, I said, "You ever hear anything odd about that house on Riverside? The one across from the cemetery?" He gave me a quick look, then focused on the register. "Old places, old stories," he said. "What kind of odd?" "Just, I don't know," I said. "History. Who lived there before my folks?" He tore off the receipt, handed it to me, and shrugged. "Ellison's been there a long time," he said. "Different branches. Before you, there was another Ellison family in that place. Small boy, if I remember right. Sickly. They kept the porch light on for him when he had to stay at the hospital. Saw it from the street all hours of the night. Your daddy bought it after they moved away." "Moved away?" I said. "That's what I heard," he said. "Could be I'm mixing stories. Things blur. You get to my age. Do you remember their boy's name?" I asked. He shook his head slowly, frowning like he was trying to push his memory further than it wanted to go. "Something close to yours," he said finally. "Mark, maybe. Martin. Marvin. I wouldn't swear to it." Back home, I dug through the old metal box where my father kept deeds and insurance policies and all the important papers. I found the deed to the house, a stack of paid tax bills, and folded between them, an older envelope with a return address from some law office. Inside was a letter about the sale of the property. It mentioned the previous owners, the Ellison family, and something about lot coordinates adjusted to align with cemetery boundary revisions. Further down the page, a name was typed, then corrected with a line of pen, in reference to minor child, Marvin E., and then ink scratched it out. My own father's handwriting had circled that line and written, "Error," in the margin. I sat at the kitchen table with that letter for a long time, the fridge humming in the background, Derek's TV muttering faintly down the hall. That evening, I went back into the cemetery in daylight. The air was hot, the kind that makes your shirt stick to your back. Gravel crunched under my shoes in that familiar way, each step small and deliberate. I walked straight to the magnolia, to the small leaning stone. The jar of flowers was there again. Different flowers this time, yellow ones, still fresh. I knelt down, ignoring the way my knees protested, and brushed the stone again. I could see the faint letters more clearly in the slant of the late afternoon sun. Marv something, then the rest eaten away. The last name, too, was almost gone, but there was a definite shape of an E at the start and Lyson at the end. The dates were worn, but I could make out a birth year and a death year only a few years apart. 5, maybe 6. While I was there, the sound in the cemetery changed. The birds that had been chattering in the trees went quiet all at once. No breeze, no big noise to startle them, just silence, sudden and full. A chipmunk that had been rustling in the dry leaves near the path darted under a stone and stayed there. I straightened slowly, every movement feeling louder than it should. Someone cleared their throat behind me. I turned so fast I almost lost my balance. An older man in a green work shirt stood a few feet away, hand resting on the handle of a push mower. I recognized him as one of the groundskeepers I'd seen from the porch now and then. He nodded at me, polite but reserved. "Afternoon," he said. "Hey," I said, my voice sounding a bit thin. "Hope I'm not in your way." "Not at all," he said, his eyes flicked to the stone I'd been kneeling by. "You family?" "I don't think so," I said. "The name looks kind of like mine. That's all." He looked at the stone again, then back at me. "Names move around," he said. "Stones too." "What do you mean?" I asked. He shifted his weight, looked toward the river. "Cemeteries older than the records," he said. "They shifted plots when the bank started to erode. Some stones got moved, some didn't. Some folks got buried where they weren't supposed to. Paperwork never quite caught up." He paused. "Some burials aren't what you think they are." I waited for him to explain that, but he just pushed the mower's handle down, starting to roll it away. "Who leaves the flowers?" I asked his back. He didn't turn around. "We just cut the grass," he said. "We don't keep track of who loves who." The mower wheels rattled over the gravel as he walked off. The birds started up again slowly, one by one, like somebody was easing the volume back up. I stood there for another minute, then went home. That night, I changed the porch light bulb. I bought the brightest one I could find at the hardware store, even though the fixture was old and I wasn't sure it would make a difference. When I switched it on, it still hummed, but the light seemed a little steadier, a little whiter around the edges. It shone straight across the street, through the iron bars of the fence, and onto the first few rows of stones. Derek moved out a few months after that. He said the shifts were killing him and he'd found a place closer to the mill with some guys from work. He left behind a couple of mugs, an old jacket, and the boot rack by the front door. Rusty stayed with me. He's gone now too, buried in the backyard under the small dogwood tree, where you can't see the cemetery if you're standing there. A lot of years have passed since that summer. I've heard other sounds on the porch at night. Sometimes it's just the creak of the boards, the tap of a loose shutter, the softer than rainfall sound of magnolia leaves skittering across the sidewalk. Once in a while, very late, I'll hear the faint crunch of gravel across the street, even when I know the gates are closed. Every so often, if I sit very still in my chair by the window and look out just past the reflection of my own face, I'll notice that grave under the magnolia. The flowers at its base are always fresh. I've stopped asking who puts them there. I've thought about moving. God knows, there are newer houses in newer neighborhoods that don't look out over old stones and river fog. But the idea of some stranger sitting in my chair, flipping on this porch light, looking out at that same view, feels wrong in a way I can't quite explain. This house knows me. The floor knows the pattern of my steps. The hinges know how I close the doors. The porch light knows when I flip that switch. I'm not saying I believe in anything. I still tell myself there are explanations I just haven't found. Bad wiring, old records, a tired brain hearing familiar voices and random sounds. It's easier to think that way. It lets you sleep more nights than you stay awake. I will say this though. On foggy evenings, when the river breathes that low gray across the stones and the insects on that side of the road go quiet all at once, I don't open the front door. I don't peek behind the curtain to see if anything is standing at the gate. I don't kneel by that little leaning stone anymore to try and read what's left of the name. I walk to the switch by the door, same as I've done since I was young, and I turn the porch light on. It hums, flickers once, then settles into its glow, throwing a small circle of brightness out over the steps and toward the fence and the graves beyond. I still keep the porch light on, facing the stones.